Hey guys, Orcbrand here. I'm going to continue helping my illiterate friends resist the demonic threat by reading to you from Seraphim Rose's Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future. Um, I did just get banned from Twitter for some bullshit that was totally uncool because I've been very well behaved. So follow me at my formerly private account, currently main account at orcbrand_br, orc spelled with a C this time rather than a K. Um, that's about it. I'm gonna go over what we went over last time, which is ecumenism, Hinduism, and the fakir's sorcery, which is still Hinduism. So now we're going to start with Chapter 4, Eastern Meditation Invades Christianity, and hopefully we can get to the UFOs by the end of the day. Four, Eastern meditation invades Christianity. As an answer to the question of the possibility of a dialogue of Orthodox Christianity with the various non-Christian religions, the reader has been presented by the testimony of three Orthodox Christians who confirm, on the basis of Orthodox doctrine and their own experience, what the Orthodox Church has always taught, that Orthodox Christians do not all have the same God as the monotheists who deny the Holy Trinity, and that the gods of the pagans are in fact demons, that thus the experiences and powers which the pagan gods can and do provide are satanic in nature. All this in no way contradicts the words of St. Peter, that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation he that feareth him, that worketh righteousness, is acceptable to him. Acts 10:34-35. Or the words of St. Paul, that God in times past has suffered all nations to walk in their own ways. Nevertheless, he left not himself without witness, and that he did good, and gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. Acts 14:17. Those who live in the bondage of Satan, the prince of this world, John 12:31, in darkness, which is unenlightened by the Christian gospel, are judged in light of the natural testimony of God, of which every man may have, despite his bondage. For the Christian, however, who has been given God's revelation, no dialogue is possible with those outside the faith. Be ye not equally yoked with the unbelievers? For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communion hath light with darkness? And what concord hath Christ with Belial? Or what part hath he that believeth with an infidel? Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord. 2 Corinthians 6:14-17. The Christian calling is rather to bring the light of Orthodox Christianity to them, even as St. Peter did to the God-fearing household of Cornelius the centurion. Acts 10:34-48, in order to enlighten their darkness and join them to the chosen flock of Christ's church. All of this is obvious enough to Orthodox Christians who are aware of the faithful to the truth of God's revelation in the Church of Christ. But many who consider themselves Christian have very little awareness of the radical difference between Christianity and all other religions, and some who may have this awareness have very little discernment in the area of spiritual experiences, a discernment that has been practiced and handed down in Orthodox patristic writings and lives of saints for nearly 2,000 years. In the absence of such awareness and discernment, the increasing presence of Eastern religious movements in the West, especially in the past decade or two, has caused great confusion in the minds of the many would-be Christians. The case of Thomas Merton comes immediately to mind, a sincere convert to Roman Catholicism and Catholic monasticism some 40 years ago, long before the radical reforms of Vatican II. He ended his days proclaiming the equality of Christian religious experiences and the experience of Zen Buddhism and other pagan religions. Something has entered the air in the past 2 decades or so that eroded whatever remained of a sound Christian outlook in Protestantism and Roman Catholicism, and now is attacking the Church itself, Holy Orthodoxy. The dialogue with non-Christian religions is a result rather than cause of this new spirit. In this chapter, we shall examine some of the Eastern religious movements which have been influential in the 1970s, with special emphasis on the attempt to develop the syncretism of Christianity and Eastern religions, particularly in the realm of spiritual practices. Such attempts more often than not cite the Philokalia, an Eastern Orthodox tradition of contemplative prayer, as being more akin to Eastern spiritual practices than anything that exists in the West. It is time enough then to point out clearly the great abyss that exists between Christian and non-Christian spiritual experience, and why the religious philosophy that underlies this new syncretism is false and dangerous. Sponsor. Christian yoga. Hindu yoga has been known in the West for many decades, and especially in America, it has given rise to innumerable cults and also to a popular form of physical therapy, which is supposedly non-religious in its aims. Nearly 20 years ago, a French Benedictine monk wrote of his experiences in making yoga a Christian discipline. The description what follows is taken from his book, J.M. Deschenais, Christian Yoga, Harper and Row, 1972. Hindu yoga is a discipline that presupposes a rather abstemious, disciplined life, and is composed of breath control and certain physical postures which produce a state of relaxation in which one meditates, usually with the help of a mantra or sacred utterance which aids concentration. The essence of yoga is not the discipline itself, but the meditation which is its end. The author is correct when he writes, "The aim of Hindu yoga are spiritual. It is tantamount to treason to forget this and retain only the purely physical side of this ancient discipline, to see in it no more than a means toward bodily health or beauty." To this, it should be added that the person who uses yoga only for physical well-being is already disposing himself towards certain spiritual attitudes and even experiences which he is undoubtedly unaware. Of this, more will be said below. The same author then continues, "The art of the yogi is to establish himself in a complete silence, to empty himself of all thoughts and illusions, to discard and forget everything but this one idea: man's true self is divine, it is God, and the rest is silence." This idea, of course, is not Christian but pagan, but the aim of Christian yoga is to use the technique of yoga for a different spiritual end, for a Christian meditation. The object of the yoga technique in this view is to make one relaxed, content, unthinking, passive, and receptive to spiritual ideas and experiences. As soon as you have taken up the posture, you will feel your body relaxing, and feeling of general well-being will establish itself in you. The exercises produce an extraordinary sense of calm. To begin with, one gets the feeling of a general unwinding, of well-being taking hold, of a euphoria that will, and in fact does, last. If one's nerves have been tense and overstrung, the exercises calm them, and fatigue disappears in a little time. The goal of all his efforts is to silence the thinking self in him by shutting his eyes to every kind of enticement. The euphoria which yoga brings could well be called a state of health that allows us to do more and do it better on the human plane to begin with, and on the Christian religious spiritual plane afterwards. The most apt word to describe it is contentedness, a contentedness that inhabits the body and soul and predisposes us toward the spiritual life. One's whole personality can be changed by it. Hatha yoga influences character to the good. One man, after some weeks of practice, admits he is no longer himself, and everyone notices a change in his bearing and reaction. He is gentler and more understanding. He faces experience calmly. He is content. His whole personality has been altered, and he himself feels it studying and opening it out. From this, there arises an almost permanent condition of euphoria, of contentedness. But all of this is only a preparation for a spiritual aim, which begins to make itself felt in a very short time. By becoming contemplative in a matter of weeks, my prayer had been given a particular and novel cast. Becoming extraordinarily calm, the author notices the ease I felt entering into prayer and concentrating on a subject. One becomes more receptive to impulses and promptings from heaven. The practice of yoga makes for increased suppleness and receptivity, and thus for openness and thus personal exchanges between God and soul that mark the way of the mystical life. Even for the apprentice yogi, prayer becomes sweet and embraces the whole man. One is relaxed and ready to tremble at the touch of the Holy Ghost, to receive and welcome what God in his goodness thinks fit to let us experience. We shall be making our being ready to be taken, to be seized, and this is surely one of the aims, in fact, the highest of Christian contemplation. Every day, the exercises and indeed the whole ascetic discipline of my yoga make it easier for the grace of Christ to flow in me. I feel my hunger for God growing and my thirst for righteousness and my desire to be a Christian in the full strength of the word. Anyone who understands the nature of prelest, a spiritual deception, will recognize in the description of Christian yoga precisely the characteristics of those who have gone spiritually astray, whether into pagan religious experiences or sectarian Christian experiences. The same striving for holy and divine feelings, the same openness and willingness to be seized by a spirit, the same seeking not for God but for spiritual consolations, the same self-intoxication which is mistaken for a state of grace, the same incredible ease with which one becomes contemplative or mystical, the same mystical revelations and pseudo-spiritual states. These are the common characteristics of all who are in this particular state of spiritual deception. But the author of Christian Yoga, being a Benedictine monk, also adds some particular meditations which reveal him as a fully in the spirit of the Roman Catholic meditation of recent centuries, which is with its free play of fantasies on Christian themes. Thus, for example, having meditated on the theme of Christmas Eve Mass, he begins to see the child in the arms of his mother. I gaze, nothing more. Pictures, ideas, association of ideas, Savior, King Light, Halo, Shepherd, Child Light again, come one after the other, march past, all these pieces of sacred puzzle taken together to arouse one idea in me, a silent vision of the whole mystery of Christmas. Anyone with the slightest knowledge of Orthodox spiritual discipline will see that this pitiable Christian yogi has fallen handily into a trap set by one of the lesser demons that lie in wait for the seeker of spiritual experiences. He has not even seen an angel of light, but has only given way to his own religious fancies, the product of a heart and mind totally unprepared for spiritual warfare and the deceptions of the demons. Such meditation is being practiced today in a number of Roman Catholic convents and monasteries. The fact that the book concludes with an article by the French translation of the Philokalia, together with excerpts from the Philokalia, only reveals the abyss that separates these dilettantes from the true spirituality of Orthodoxy, which is totally inaccessible to the modern wise men who no longer understand its language. A sufficient indication of the author's incompetence in understanding the Philokalia is in fact that he gives the name prayer of the heart, which in Orthodox tradition is the highest mental prayer, acquired by the very few after many years of ascetic struggle, being humbled by a true God-bearing elder, do the easy trick of reciting syllables in rhythm with the heartbeat. We shall comment more fully below to the dangers of this Christian yoga when noting that it possesses in common with other forms of Eastern meditation which are being offered to Christians today. Christian Zen. An Eastern religious practice on a more popular level is offered in the book of an Irish Catholic priest, William Johnston. Christian Zen. The author starts from basically the same place as the author of Christian Yoga. A feeling of dissatisfaction with Western Christianity. A desire to give it a dimension of contemplation or meditation. Many people discontented with old forms of prayer, discontented with old devotions that once served so well, are looking for something that will satisfy the aspirations of the modern heart. Contact with Zen has opened up new vistas, teaching me that there are possibilities in Christianities I never dreamed of. One may practice Zen as a way of deepening and broadening his Christian faith. The technique of Japanese Zen is very similar to that of Indian yoga, from which it is ultimately derived, although it is rather simpler. There is the same basic posture, but not the variety of postures of yoga, breathing technique, the repetition of a sacred name if desired, as well as other techniques peculiar to Zen. The aim of these techniques is the same as that of yoga, to abolish rational thinking and to attain a state of calm, silent meditation. The sitting position impedes discursive reasoning and thinking and enables one to go down to the center of one's being in imageless and silent contemplation, to a deep and beautiful realm of psychic life, to deep interior silence. The experience thus attained is somewhat similar to that achieved by taking drugs, for people who have used drugs understand a little about Zen, since they have been awakened to the realization that there is a depth to the mind worth exploring. And yet this experience opens up a new approach to Christ, an approach that is less dualistic and more oriental. Even absolute beginners in Zen can attain a sense of union in an atmosphere of supernatural presence, a savoring of a mystical silence through Zen. A state of contemplation hitherto restricted to a few mystics can be broadened out. All may have vision, all may reach samadhi, or enlightenment. Right back. The author of Christian Zen speaks of the renewal of Christianity, but he admits that the experience he thinks can bring it about may be had by anyone, Christian or non-Christian. I believe that there is a basic enlightenment which is neither Christian nor Buddhist nor anything else, that is just human. Indeed, at a convention on meditation at a Zen temple near Kyoto, the surprising thing about the meeting was the lack of any common faith. No one seemed the slightest bit interested in what anyone else believed or disbelieved, and no one, as far as I recall, even mentioned the name of God. This agnostic character of meditation had a great advantage for missionary purposes, and for in this way meditation can be taught to people who have little faith, to those who are troubled in conscience or fear of God or fear that God is dead. Such people can always sit and breathe. For them meditation becomes a search, and I have found that people who begin to search in this way eventually find God. Not the anthropomorphic God they have rejected, but the great being in whom we live, move, and are. The author's description of Zen enlightenment experience reveals its basic identity with the cosmic experiences provided by shamanism and many pagan religions. I myself believe that within us are locked up torrents and torrents of joy that can be released by meditation. Sometimes they will burst through with an incredible force, flooding the personality with an extraordinary happiness that comes from one knows not where. Interestingly, the author, on returning to America after 20 years in Japan, found this experience to be very close to the Pentecostal experience, and he himself received the baptism of the Spirit at a charismatic meeting. The author concluded, returning to the Pentecostal meeting, it seems to me that the imposition of hands, the prayers of the people, the charity of the community, these can be forces that release the psychic power that brings enlightenment to the person who has been consistently practicing Zazen. We shall examine the 7th chapter of the book, The Nature of the Pentecostal Charismatic Experience. Little need to be said in criticism of these views. They are basically the same as those of the author of Christian Yoga, and only less esoteric and more popular. Anyone who believes that the agnostic pagan experience of Zen can be used for a contemplative renewal within Christianity surely knows nothing whatsoever of the great contemplative tradition of Orthodoxy, which presupposes burning faith, true belief, and intense ascetic struggle, and yet the same author does not hesitate to drag the Philokalia and the great Orthodox schools into his narrative, stating that they also lead to the contemplation of contemplative silence and peace and are an example of Zen within the Christian tradition. And he advocates the use of prayer of Jesus during Zen meditation for those who wish this. Such ignorance is positively dangerous, especially when the possessor of it invites the students at his lectures as an experiment in mysticism to sit in Zazen for 40 minutes each evening. How many sincere, misguided, false prophets there are in the world today, each thinking he is bringing benefit to his fellow man, instead of an invitation to psychic and spiritual disaster. Of all of this we shall speak more in the conclusion below. Transcendental meditation. The technique of Eastern meditation known as Transcendental Meditation, or TM for short, has attained such popularity in few years, especially in America, and is advocated in such outrageously flippant tone that any serious student of contemporary religious currents will be inclined at first to dismiss it as merely an overinflated product of American advertising and showmanship. But this would be a mistake, for its serious claims it does not differ markedly from yoga and Zen, and close look at its techniques reveals it as perhaps more authentically Eastern than either of the somewhat artificial syncretism Christian yoga and Christian Zen. According to one standard account of this movement, all citations of this section are from John Robbins and David Fisher, Tranquility Without Pills, All About Transcendental Meditation, Peter H. Wyden, Incorporated, New York, 1972. Transcendental meditation was brought to America, where it had its most spectacular success, by a rather unorthodox Indian yogi, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and began to grow noticeably in 1961. In 1967, it received widespread publicity when popular singers known as the Beatles were converted to it and gave up drugs. But they soon abandoned the movement, although they continued to meditate, and the Maharishi hit his low point in the next year when his American tour, together with another convert singing group called the Beach Boys, was abandoned as a financial failure. The movement itself, however, continued to grow. By 1971, there were some 100,000 meditators following it. By 2000, with 2,000 specially trained instructors, making it already by far the largest movement in Eastern spirituality in America. In 1975, the movement reached its peak, with about 40,000 trainees a month and upwards of 600,000 followers in all. During these years, it was widely used in the army, public schools, prisons, hospitals, and by church groups, including parishes of the Greek Archdiocese in America, as supposedly neutral form of mental therapy, which is compatible with any kind of religious belief or practice. The TM, of course, was one especially tailored to the American way of life, and has been sympathetically called a course in how to succeed spiritually without really trying. The Maharishi himself calls it a technique which is just like brushing your teeth. The Maharishi has been strongly criticized by other Hindu yogis for cheapening the long tradition of yoga in India by making this esoteric practice available to the masses for money. The charge as 1975 was $125 for the course, $65 for college students, and progressively less for high school, junior high school, and very young children. In its aims, presuppositions, and results, TM does not differ markedly from Christian yoga or Christian Zen. It differs from them chiefly in the simplicity of its techniques and of its whole philosophy, and in the ease with which its results are obtained. Like them, TM does not require any belief, understanding, moral code, or even agreement with the ideas and philosophy. It is a technique, pure and simple, which is based on the natural tendency of the mind to move toward greater happiness and pleasure. During transcendental meditation, your mind is exposed to follow whatever is most natural and most pleasant. Transcendental meditation is a practice first and a theory afterwards. It is essential at the beginning that an individual does not think intellectually at all. The technique which Maharishi has devised is invariably the same as all TM centers throughout the world. After 2 introductory lectures, one pays the fee and then comes for initiation, bringing with him a seemingly strange collection of articles, always the same: 3 pieces of sweet fruit, at least 6 of fresh flowers, and a clean handkerchief. These are all placed in a basket and taken to the initiation room, where they are placed on a table before a portrait of the Maharishi's guru, and from whom he received his initiation into yoga. On the same table, a candle and incense are burning. The disciple is alone in the room with his teacher, who is himself required to have received initiation and to have been instituted by the Maharishi personally. The ceremony before the portrait lasts for half an hour and is composed of soft singing in Sanskrit, with the meaning unknown to the initiate, and a chanting of the names of the past masters of yoga. At the end of the ceremony, the initiate is given a mantra, a secret Sanskrit word, which he is to repeat ceaselessly during meditation, which no one is to know except his teacher. The English translation of the ceremony is never revealed to the initiates. It is available only to teachers and the initiators themselves. It is contained in an unpublished handbook called the holy tradition, and its text has been printed by the Spiritual Counterfeits Project in Berkeley as a separate pamphlet. This ceremony is nothing but a traditional Hindu ceremony of worship of the gods, puja, including the deified guru of the Maharishi, Sri Guru Dev, and the whole line of masters through which he himself received his initiation. The ceremony ends with a series of 22 offerings made to the Maharishi's guru, each ending with the words, "To Sri Guru Dev I bow down." The initiator himself bows down before the portrait of Guru Dev at the end of the ceremony and invites the initiate to do likewise. Only then is the letter initiated. The bowing is not absolutely required to the initiate, but the offerings are. Thus, the modern agnostic, usually quite unawares, has been introduced to the realm of Hindu religions and practices. Quite easily, he has been made to do something which his own Christian ancestors, perhaps, had preferred torture and cruel death. He has offered sacrifice to pagan gods. On the spiritual plane, it may be this sin, rather than the psychic technique itself, that chiefly explains the spectacular success of TM. Once he has been initiated, the student of TM meditates twice daily for 20 minutes each time, precisely the same amount recommended by the author of Christian Yoga, letting the mind wander freely and repeating the mantra as often as he thinks of it. Frequently, one's experiences are checked by his teacher. Quite soon, even on his first attempt, one begins to enter a new level of consciousness, which is neither sleep nor wakefulness, the state of transcendental meditation. Transcendental meditation produces a state of consciousness unlike anything we've known before, and closest to the state of Zen, developed after many years of intense study. In contrast to the years that must be spent to master the other religious disciplines of yoga, which offer the same results that TM proponents claim, teachers say TM can be taught in a matter of minutes. Some who have experienced it described it as a state of fulfillment, similar to some drug experiences, but the Maharishi himself describes it in traditional Hindu terms. This state lies beyond all seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, and tasting, beyond all thinking and feeling. This state is the unmanifested, absolute, pure consciousness of being and the ultimate state of life. When an individual has developed the ability to bring this deep state in his conscious level on a permanent basis, he is said to have reached cosmic consciousness, the goal of all meditators. In advanced stages of TM, the basic yoga positions are taught, but they are not necessary to the success of the basic technique. Nor is any acidic preparation required. Once one has attained the transcendental state of being, all that is required of one is 20 minutes of meditation twice daily, since this form of meditation is not at all a separate way of life as in India, but rather a discipline for those who lead an active life. The Maharishi's distinction lies in having brought the state of consciousness to everyone, not just a chosen few. There are numerous success stories for TM, which claims to be effective in almost all cases. Drug habits are overcome, families are reunited, one becomes healthy and happy, the teachers of TM are constantly smiling, bubbling over their happiness. Generally, TM does not replace other religions, but strengthens belief, if anything. Christians, whether Protestant or Catholic, also find it makes their belief and practice more meaningful and deeper. The swift and easy success of TM, while it is symptomatic of the waning influence of Christianity on contemporary mankind, has also led to its earthly discipline. Perhaps more than any other movement of Eastern spirituality, it has had the character of a fad, and the Maharishi's announced aim to initiate the whole of humanity is evidently doomed to failure. After the peak year of 1975, enrollment in TM courses has steadily declined, so much so that in 1977, the organization announced the opening of a whole new series of advanced courses, obviously devised in order to regain public interest and enthusiasm. These courses are intended to lead initiates to the siddhis, or supernatural powers of Hinduism, walking through walls, becoming invisible, levitating and flying through the air, and the like. The courses have generally been greeted with cynicism, even though a TM brochure features a photograph of a levitating meditator. See Time Magazine, August 8, 1977, page 75. Whether or not the courses, which cost up to $3,000, will produce claimed results, which are in the province of traditional fakirs of India, see above, pages 30-35. We just read this in the previous video. TM itself stands revealed as passing phase of the occult interest in the second half of the 20th century. Already many examples have publicized of TM teachers and disciples alike who have been afflicted with the common maladies of those who dabble in the occult: mental and emotional illness, suicide, attempted murder, and demonic possession. In 1978, a United States federal court came to the decision that TM is indeed religious in nature and may not be taught in public schools. See TM in Court, the complete text of the federal court's opinion on the case of Malnak versus Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, Spiritual Counterfeits Project. This decision will undoubtedly further limit the influence of TM, which of course will probably continue to exist as one of the many forms of meditation which many see as compatible with Christianity. Another sad sign of the times. David Lynch was reportedly associated with TM fairly recently. FYI, look into it. Next chapter. I'll be right back. Chapter 5, The New Religious Consciousness, the Spirit of the Eastern Cults in the 1970s. The three kinds of Christian meditation described above are only the beginning. In general, it may be said that the influence of Eastern religious ideas and practices upon the once Christian West has reached astonishing proportion in the decade of the 1970s. In particular, America, which barely 2 decades ago was still religiously provincial, save in a few large cities, its spiritual horizon largely limited to Protestantism and Roman Catholicism, has seen a dazzling proliferation of Eastern and pseudo-Eastern religious cults and movements. The history of this proliferation can be traced from the restless disillusionment of post-World War II generation, which first manifested itself in the 1950s in the empty protest and moral libertinism of the Beat generation, whose interest in Eastern religions was at first rather academic and mainly a sign of dissatisfaction with, quote, Christianity. There followed a second generation that of the hippies of the 1960s, with its rock, music, and psychedelic drugs, in search for increased awareness at any cost. Now young Americans are plunged wholeheartedly into political protest movements, notably against the war in Vietnam, on the one hand, and fervent practices of Eastern religions on the other. Indian gurus, Tibetan lamas, Japanese Zen masters, and other sages, Eastern, came to the West and found a host of ready disciples who made them successful beyond the dreams of westernized swamis of preceding generations. The young people traveled to the ends of the world, even to the heights of the Himalayas, to find the wisdom of the teacher or the drug that would bring them the peace and freedom they sought. In the 1970s, a third generation has succeeded the hippies. Outwardly quieter, with fewer demonstrations and generally less flamboyant behavior, this generation has gone more deeply into Eastern religions, whose influence now became much more pervasive than ever. For many of the newer generations, the religious search has ended. They have found an Eastern tradition to their liking and are now seriously occupied in practicing it. A number of Eastern religious movements have already become native to the West, especially in America. They are now there are now Buddhist monasteries composed entirely of Western converts, and for the first time there have appeared American and other Western gurus and Zen masters. Let us look at just a few pictures, descriptions of actual events in the early and mid-1970s, which illustrate the dominance of Eastern ideas and practices among many young Americans, who are only the avant-garde of the youth of the whole world. The first two pictures show a more superficial involvement with Eastern religions, and are perhaps the only a leftover from the generation of the 1960s. The last two reveal a deeper involvement that is characteristic of the 1970s. 1. Hare Krishnas in San Francisco. On a street bordering Golden State Park in the High Ashbury section of San Francisco stood the Krishna Consciousness Temple. Above the entrance to the temple were 2-foot-high the 2-foot-high wooden letters Hare Krishna. The large storefront windows were covered with red and orange patterned blankets. The sounds of chanting and music filled the street. Inside there were dozens of brightly colored paintings on the wall, thick red rugs on the floor, and a smoky haze in the air. This smoke was incense, an element of the ceremony in progress. The people in the room were softly chanting barely audible Sanskrit words. The room was nearly full, with 50 people who all appeared to be young sitting on the floor. Assembled in front were about 20 persons wearing long, loose-fitting orange and saffron robes with white paint on their noses. Many of the men had shaved their heads except for a ponytail. The women with them had also white paint on their noses and small red marks on their foreheads. The other young persons in the room appeared no different from other denizens of Haight-Ashbury, costumed with headbands, long hair, beads, and an assortment of rings, bells, and beads. They were also enthusiastically participating in the ceremony. The 10 or so persons sitting in the rear appeared to be first-time visitors. The chanting ceremony, mantra, increased in tempo and volume. 2 girls in long saffron robes were now dancing to the chant. The leader of the chant began to cry the words of the chant in Sanskrit. The entire group repeated the words and attempted to maintain the leader's intonation and rhythm. Many of the participants played musical instruments. The leader was beating a hand drum in time with his chanting. The 2 swaying, dancing girls were playing finger cymbals. One young man was blowing a seashell. Another was beating on a tambourine. On the walls of the temple were over a dozen paintings of the scenes of the Bhagavad Gita. The music and chanting grew very loud and fast. The drum was ceaselessly pounding. Many of the devotees started personal shouts, hands upstretched amidst a general chant. The leader knelt in front of a picture of the group's spiritual master on a small shrine near the front of the room. The chanting culminated in a loud crescendo, and the room became silent. The celebrants knelt with their heads on the floor as the leader said a short prayer in Sanskrit. Then he shouted 5 times, "All glories to the assembled devotees," which with the others repeated before they sat up. This is from Charles Glock and Robert Bella's The New Religious Consciousness by the University of California Press, Berkeley, 1976. This is one of the typical worship services of the Krishna Consciousness movement, which was founded in America in 1966 by Indian ex-businessman A.C. Bhaktivedanta, in order to bring Hindu discipline of bhakti yoga to the disoriented and searching young people of the West. The earlier phase of interest in Eastern religions in the 1950s and early 1960s had emphasized intellectual investigation without much personal involvement. This newer phase demands wholehearted participation. Bhakti yoga means uniting oneself to one's chosen God by love and worshiping Him, and changing one's whole life in order to make one's central occupation. Through non-rational means of worship, chanting, music, dance, devotion, the mind is expanded and Krishna consciousness is attained, which, if enough people will to it is supposed to end in troubles of our disoriented age and usher in a new age of peace, love, and unity. The bright robes of the Krishnas became a familiar sight in San Francisco, especially on the day of every year when the immense idol of their god was wheeled through the Golden Gate Park to the ocean, attended by all signs of Hindu devotion, a typical scene of pagan India, but something new for Christian America. From San Francisco, the movement had spread to the rest of America and to Western Europe. By 1974, there were 54 Krishna temples throughout the world, many of them near colleges and universities. Members of the movement are almost all very young. The recent death of the founder of the movement has raised questions about its future, and indeed its membership, although very visible, has been rather small in number. As a sign of the times, however, the meaning of the movement is clear and should be disturbing to Christians. Many young people today are looking for a God to worship, and most blatant form of paganism is not too much for them to accept. A moment. Guru Maharaji at the Houston Astrodome. By the fall of 1973, a number of Eastern gurus of the newer school, led by Maharishi Mahesh Yoga, with his TM, had come to the West and gathered a following, only to fade from the public eye after a brief reign in the glare of publicity. Guru Maharaji Ji was the most spectacular and, one might say, outrageous of these gurus. 15 years old, he had already been proclaimed to be God. His family, mother and 3 brothers, was the Holy Family, and his organization, the Divine Light Mission, had communities, ashrams, all over America. His 80,000 followers, premies, like all the followers of Krishna, were expected to give up worldly pleasures and to meditate in order to attain an expanded consciousness which made them perfectly peaceful, happy, and blissed out. A state of mind in which everything seems to be beautiful and perfect just the way it is. In a special initiation in which they receive the knowledge, disciples are shown an intense light and 3 other signs within themselves, which later they were able to meditate on by themselves. In addition to this knowledge, disciples are united in believing the Maharaji is the Lord of the universe, who has come to inaugurate a new age of peace for mankind. For 3 days in November 1973, the Divine Light Mission rented the Houston Astrodome, an immense sports arena entirely covered by a dome, in order to stage the most holy and significant event in the history of mankind. Premies from all over the world were together to worship their God and to begin a conversion of America, through the mass media, whose representatives were carefully invited to the same worship, thus beginning a new age for mankind. Appropriately, the event was called Millennium 73. Typical of Maharaji's convinced disciples was Ronnie Davis, a leftist demonstrator of the 1960s and one of the Chicago 7 accused of inciting riots at the 1968 Democratic National Convention. He spent the summers of 1973 giving press conferences and speeches to whoever would listen, telling America, "He is the greatest event in history and we sleep through it. I feel like shouting it in the streets. If we knew who he was, we would crawl across America on our hands and knees to rest our heads at his feet." Robert Greenfield, The Spiritual Supermarket, Saturday Review Press, New York, 1975. Indeed, the worship of Maharaji is expressed in full prostration before him with one's head to the ground, together with a Sanskrit phrase of adoration. A tremendous ovation greeted his appearance at Millennium 73. He sat atop a tall throne, crowned by an immense golden crown of Krishna, as the Astrodome scoreboard flashed the word G-O-D. Young American premies wept for joy. Others danced on the stage. The band played The Lord of the Universe, adapted from the old Protestant hymn. All this, let us say again, in Christian America. This held already something beyond mere worship of pagan gods. Until very few years ago, such worship of a living man would have been inconceivable in any Christian nation. Now it has become an ordinary thing for many thousands of religious seekers in the West. Here we have already had a preview of the worship of the Antichrist at the end of the age. The one who will sit in the temple of God, setting himself forth as God. 2 Thessalonians 2:4. Millennium 73 seems to have been at the peak of Maharaji's influence. As it was, only 15,000 followers attended it, much less than expected, and there was no miracles or special signs to indicate the new age had actually begun. A movement so dependent on media publicity and so much bound up in the popular taste of a particular generation, the music in Millennium 73 was composed mostly of popular songs of the counterculture of the 1960s, can expect to go out of fashion rather quickly. And the recent marriage of Maharaji to his secretary has further weakened the popularity as a quote god. Other spiritual movements of our time seem to be less subject to the whims of popular fashion and more indicative of the depth of the influence of Eastern religions who are now attaining the West. Tantric Yoga in the mountains of New Mexico. In the grassy meadow at the 7,500-foot elevation in the Jemez Mountains in northern New Mexico, 1,000 young Americans, most of them between the ages of 20 and 25, gathered for 10 days of spiritual exercises at the time of the summer solstice in June 1973. They rise at 4 a.m. every day and assemble before sunrise, wrapped in blankets against a morning frost, to sit on the ground in rows in front of an outdoor stage. Together, they begin the day with a mantra in Punjabi, a Sanskritic language, in order to tune in to the spiritual practices that are to follow. First, there are several hours of Kulandali Yoga, a series of strenuous physical exercises, chanting, and meditation aimed at acquiring conscious control of the body and mind processes and preparing one for God realization. There has been a ceremony of raising of two flags, the American flag and the flag of the Aquarian nation. This nation has being a peaceful people of the Aquarian age, or millennium, for which this cult is preparing, accompanied by the singing of God Bless America and a prayer for the American nation. After a vegetarian meal, almost all new cults, and lectures on spiritual and practical subjects, all prepare for a long session of Tantric Yoga. Tantric Yoga has been little heard of and almost never practiced in the West up until now. All authorities agree it is an extremely dangerous practice, practiced almost always by male and female together, that evokes a very powerful psychic energy requiring close supervision and control. Supposedly, there is only one master of Tantric Yoga living on the earth at any one time. The exercise at solstice in New Mexico were led by the great tantric of our days, Yogi Bhajan. All dressed identically in white, sit down in a long straight lines, men opposite women, packed shoulder to shoulder down the lines and back to back with the next line. About 10 double lines stretch out from the stage, each 75 feet long. Assistants make sure these lines are perfectly straight and assure the proper flow of the yogic magnetic field. The chanting of mantras begins with special chants invoking the departed guru, who is Yogi Bhajan's special protector. The yogi himself, an impressive man, 6'4", with a great black beard, dressed in a white robe and turban, appears and begins to speak with his dream for a new, beautiful, creative nation of America, which can be built by the spiritual preparation of people today. The tantric exercises, which are key in this preparation, transform people from their individual consciousness to group consciousness, and finally to universal consciousness. The exercises begin. They are extremely difficult, involving strong physical effort and pain, evoking strong emotions of fear, anger, love, etc. Everyone must do exactly the same thing at the same time. Difficult positions are held motionlessly for long periods. Complicated mantras and exercises must be executed in precise coordination with one's partner, with everyone's own row. Each separate exercise may take from 31 to 61 minutes. Individual awareness disappears in the intense group activity, and strong after effects are felt. Physical exhaustion and sometimes temporary paralysis, emotional exhaustion, or elation. Further, since no one at solstice is allowed to converse with anyone else, there is no opportunity to make rational sense of the experience by sharing it with others. The aim is to the effect of radical change in oneself. Following afternoon classes in such subjects are Oriental arts or self-defense, practical medicine and nutrition, and the running of an ashram. There is an evening session, after another meal, of spiritual singing. Sanskrit mantras are sung to current folk and rock music. Rock festival and joy worship in foreign tongue are joined together, part of Yogi Bhajan's effort to make his religion Native American. The religion described above is a modern adoption of the Sikh religion of northern India, joined to several practices of the yoga. Called 3HO, Healthy, Happy, Holy Organization, it was founded in 1969 in Los Angeles by Yogi Bhajan, who originally came to America to make up a teaching position and only incidentally became a religious leader when he discovered that his courses in yoga appealed to the hippies of Southern California. Combining the spiritual surge of the hippies with his knowledge of Indian religions, he formed an American religion that differs from most Eastern religions with its emphasis on this worldly practical life, like the Sikhs in India, who are mostly a merchant class. Marriage and stable home life, responsible employment, and social service are required for all members. Since its foundation in 1969, 3HO has expanded over 100 ashrams, communities which serve as gathering places for non-resident participants, in American cities, as well as a few in Europe and Japan. Although externally it is quite distinct from other New Eastern cults, full members of the cult formally become Sikhs and thereafter wear the characteristic Sikh turban and white clothing. 3HO is one with them in appealing to the ex-hippies, making an expanded or universal or transcendental consciousness its central aim, and in seeing itself as spiritual avant-garde that will bring about a new millennial age, which most groups see in astrological terms as the Aquarian Age. As a cult that advocates a relatively normal life in society, 3HO is still just as much a sign of the time as the Hindu cults that promote obvious escapism. It is preparing for a healthy, happy, holy America totally without reference to Christ. When convinced and happy, Americans speak calmly about God and their religious duties without mention of Christ. No one can longer doubt that the position. I'm sorry. One can no longer doubt that the post-Christian age has come in earnest. Zen training in Northern California. In the forested mountains of Northern California, in the shadow of immense Mount Shasta, a holy mountain to the original Indian inhabitants, a long center of occult activities and settlements, which are now once again on the increase, there has been since 1970 a Zen Buddhist monastery. Long before 1970, there had been Zen temples in the larger cities of the West Coast, where Japanese had settled, and there had been attempts to start Zen monasteries in California. But Shasta Abbey, as it is called, is the first successful American Zen monastery. In Zen Buddhism, a monastery is primarily a training school for Zen priests, both male and female. In Shasta Abbey, the atmosphere is very orderly and businesslike. Visitors, who are allowed to take guided tours at restricted times but may not fraternize with the residents, find the monks or trainees in traditional black robes and with shaved heads. Everyone seems to know exactly what he is doing, and clear sense of seriousness and dedication is present. The training itself is a strict 5-year or more program which allows the graduates to become priests and teachers of Zen and to conduct Buddhist ceremonies. As at secular schools, the trainees pay a fee for room and board, $175 a month, payable in advance each month, which means weeding out of unserious candidates. Pretty good deal, though. But the life itself is that of the monks rather than students. Strict rules govern dress and behavior. Vegetarian meals are eaten in silence communally. No visitors or idle conversations are allowed. Life centers about the meditation hall, where trainees eat and sleep in addition to meditating, and no non-Zen religious practices are allowed. The life is very intense and concentrated one, and every event of daily life, even washing and toilet, has its Buddhist prayer, which is recited silently. Although the abbey belongs to a reformed Soto Zen sect, to emphasize its independence from Japan and its adaptation to the American conditions of life, rites and ceremonies are in the Japanese Zen tradition. There is the ceremony of becoming a Buddhist, equinox rites celebrating the transformation of the individual, the ceremonies of feeding of hungry ghosts, remembrance of the dead, and Founder's Day, ceremony of expressing gratitude to the transmitters of Zen down to the present master, the festival of Buddha's enlightenment, and others. Homage is paid by bowing down before the images of Buddha, but the primary emphasis of the teaching is on the Buddha nature within one. The Zen master at Shasta Abbey is a Westerner and a woman, Buddhist practice permitting this. Jiyu Connect, an Englishwoman born of Buddhist parents of 1924 who received Buddhist training in several traditions in the Far East and ordination at a Soto Zen monastery in Japan. She came to America in 1969 and founded the monastery the next year with a few young followers. Since then, the community has grown rapidly, attracting mostly young men and women in their 20s. The reason for the success in this monastery, apart from the natural appeal of Zen to a generation sick of rationalism and mere outward learning, seems to lie in the mystique of authentic transmission of the Zen experience and tradition, which the abbess provides through her training and certification in Japan. Her personal qualities as a foreigner and a born Buddhist who is still very close touch with contemporary mind, with a very American practicality, seems to seal her influence with young American convert generation of Buddhists. The aim of Zen training at Shasta Abbey is to fill all life with pure Zen. Daily meditation, at times for as much as 8 or 10 hours in one day, is the center of a concentrated, intense religious life that leads supposedly to lasting peace and harmony of body and mind. Emphasis is on spiritual growth, and the publication of the Abbey, a bi-monthly journal, and several books of the abbess reveal a high degree of awareness of spiritual posing and fakery. The Abbey is opposed to the adoption of Japanese national, as opposed to Buddhist, customs, warns the dangers of the guru hopping and falsely worshipping the Zen master, forbids astrology, fortune-telling, even the I Ching, astral traveling, and all other psychic and occult activities, mocks the academic and intellectual as opposed to experiential approach to Zen, and emphasizes hard work and rigorous training with the banishing of all illusions and fantasies about oneself and spiritual life. Discussions on spiritual matters by the young Zen priests, as recorded in the Abbey's journal, sound, in their sober and knowledgeable tone, remarkably like discussions among young Orthodox converts and monks. In intellectual formation and outlook, these young Buddhists seem quite close to many of our Orthodox converts. The young Orthodox Christian of today might as well say, "There, but for the grace of God, I might myself be." So convincingly authentic is the spiritual outlook of the Zen monastery, which offers almost everything the young religious seeker of today might desire, except, of course, Christ the true God and the eternal salvation of which He alone can give. The monastery teaches a Buddhism that is not a cold and distant discipline, but is filled with love and compassion. Contrary to the usual expositions of Buddhism, the abbess emphasizes that the center of the Buddhist faith is not ultimate nothingness, but a living God, which she claims to be the esoteric Buddhist teachings. The secret of Zen is to know for certain, for oneself, that the cosmic Buddha exists. A true master is he or she who does not waver in his certainty and love of the cosmic Buddha. I was overjoyed when I finally knew for certain that he existed. The love and gratitude in me knew no bounds, nor have I ever felt such love as it came forth from him. I so want everyone else to feel it too. The Journal of Shasta Abbey, January-February 1978. There are presently some 70 priest trainees at Shasta Abbey and its branch priorities, chiefly in California. Branch priories. The monastery is now in a state of rapid expansion, both in its own grounds and in its mission to the American people. There is a growing movement of lay Buddhists who make the abbey their religious center and often come here, together with psychologists and other interested persons, on meditation retreats of various lengths. With their publications, counseling, and instruction in California cities, a projected children's school, and a home for the elderly, Shasta Abbey is indeed progressing in the aim of growing Zen Buddhism in the West. Toward Christianity, the abbess and her disciples have a condescending attitude. They respect the Philokalia and other Orthodox spiritual texts, recognizing Orthodoxy as the closest to them among the Christian bodies, but regards themselves as being beyond such things as theologies, doctrinal disputes, and isms, which they regard as not belonging to the true religion. Zen has, in fact, no theological foundation, relying entirely on experience, and thus falling into the pragmatic fallacy, which has already been noted earlier in this book and in the chapter on Hinduism. If it works, it must be true and good. Zen, without any theology, is no more able than Hinduism to distinguish between good and evil spiritual experiences. It can only state what seems to be good because it brings peace and harmony, as judged by the natural powers of the mind and not by any revelation. Everything else it rejects as more or less illusory. Zen appeals to the subtle pride, so widespread today, of those who think that they can save themselves and thus have no need of any savior outside themselves. Of all of today's Eastern religious currents, Zen is probably the most sophisticated intellectually and the most sober spiritually. With its teaching of compassion and a loving of cosmic Buddha, it is perhaps as high a religious ideal as a human mind can attain without Christ. Its tragedy is precisely that it has no Christ in it, and thus no salvation, and its very sophistication and sobriety effectively prevent its followers from seeking salvation in Christ. In its quiet, compassionate way, it is perhaps the saddest of all reminders that the post-Christian times in which we live, non-Christianity Non-Christian spirituality is no longer a foreign importation in the West. It has become a native American religion, putting down deep roots into the consciousness of the West. Let us be warned from this. The religion of the future will not be a mere cult or sect, but a powerful and profound religious orientation which will absolutely be convincing to the mind and heart of modern man. The new spirituality versus Christianity. Other examples of the new Eastern cults in the West could be multiplied. Each year finds new ones, or new transformations of old ones. In addition to the overtly religious cults, the last decade especially has seen an increase of secular consciousness cults, as one popular news magazine calls them. U.S. News and World Report, February 6, 1976. These mind therapy groups include Erhard Seminars trainings established in 1971, Rolfing, Silva Mind Control, and various forms of encounter and biofeedback, all of which offer release of tensions and tapping of the hidden capabilities of man, expressed in a more or less plausible 20th century scientific jargon. One is reminded also of other consciousness movements that have become less fashionable today, from Christian Science to science of mind to Scientology. All the movements are incompatible with Christianity. Orthodox Christians must be told absolutely to stay away from them. Why do we speak so categorically? 1. These movements have no foundations in Christian tradition or practice, but are purely the product of Eastern pagan religions or of modern spiritualism, more or less diluted and often presented as non-religious. They not only teach wrongly, not in accordance with Christian doctrine, about spiritual life. They also lead one, whether through pagan religious experiences or psychic experiments, into wrong spiritual path whose end is spiritual and psychic disaster, and ultimately the loss of one's soul eternally. Specifically, the experience of spiritual quietness, which is given by various kinds of meditation, whether without specific religious content, as it is claimed by TM and some forms of yoga and Zen and the secular cults, and with pagan religious content, as in Hare Krishna, the Divine Light of Mission, 3HO, etc. is an entrance to the cosmic spiritual realm where the deeper side of the human personality enters into contact with actual spiritual beings. These beings in man's fallen state are the first of all demons or fallen spirits who are closest to man. See Bishop Ignatius Bryanchinov's exposition of Orthodox teaching on the spiritual and sensuous perception of spirits in the opening of man's doors of perception in The Orthodox Word, number 82, 1978. Zen Buddhist meditators themselves, despite all their cautions about spiritual experiences, describe their encounters with these spirits mixed with human fantasies, all the while emphasizing that they are not clinging to them. See Jiu Kinet, How to Grow a Lotus Blossom, Shasta Abbey, 1977, a Zen master's description of her near-death visions. The initiation into experiences of the psychic realm, which the consciousness cults provide, involves one in something beyond the conscious control of the human will. Thus, once having been initiated, it is often a very difficult thing to untangle oneself from undesirable psychic experiences. In this way, the new religious consciousness becomes an enemy of Christianity that is more powerful and dangerous than any of the heresies of the past. When experience is emphasized above doctrine, the normal Christian safeguards which protect one against the attacks of the fallen spirits are removed or neutralized, and the passiveness and openness which characterize the new cults literally open one up to be used by demons. Studies of the experiences of many of the consciousness cults show that there is a regular progression in them from experiences which are good or neutral to experiences which become strange and frightening, and in the end clearly demonic. Even the purely physical sides of psychic disciplines like yoga are dangerous because they are derived from and dispose one toward the psychic attitudes and experiences which are the original purpose of yoga practice. The seductive power of the new religious consciousness is so great today that it can take possession of one even while he believes that he is remaining Christian. This is true not only of those who indulge in the superficial syncretisms or combinations of Christianity and Eastern religions which have been mentioned above. It is true also of an increasing number of people who regard themselves as fervent Christians. The profound ignorance of true Christian spiritual experience in our times is producing a false Christian spirituality whose nature is closely akin to new religious consciousness. In Chapter 7, we will take a long and careful look at the most widespread current of Christian spirituality today. In it, we will see the frightening prospect of a new religious consciousness taking possession of well-meaning Christians, even Orthodox Christians, to such an extent that we cannot help but think of the spirituality of contemporary world in the apocalyptic terms of the strong delusion that will deceive almost all of mankind before the end of the age. To this subject we shall return at the end of the book. Now, this next section is about UFOs. I'm going to take a break for a minute. I'll be right back. And I'm back, guys. Sorry about that. I'm going to read this next chapter, and then we're going to be done for the day. I think everyone's looking forward to this one. Oh, heck yeah. We're going to be talking about UFOs. Chapter 6. Signs from Heaven, an Orthodox Christian understanding of unidentified flying objects, UFOs. The post-World War II decades that have witnessed the astonishing increase of Eastern religious cults and influence in the West have also seen the beginning and spread of a parallel phenomenon, which, although at first sight it seems totally unrelated to religion, on closer examination turns out to be just as much a sign of the post-Christian age as the new religious consciousness as the Eastern cults. This phenomenon is that of the unidentified flying objects, which has supposedly been seen in almost every part of the world since the first flying saucer was spotted in 1947. Human credulity and superstition, which are no less present today than at any time in human history, have caused this phenomenon to be connected to some degree with the crackpot fringe of the cult world. But there has also been sufficiently serious and responsible interest in it to produce several government investigations and a number of books by reputable scientists. These investigations have come to no positive result in identifying objects as physical reality. However, the newest hypotheses made by several scientific investigators in order to explain the phenomena actually seem to come closer to a satisfactory explanation than other theories that have come proposed in the past. But at the same time, these newest hypotheses bring on to the edge of reality, as one of the new scientific books on them is called, to the boundaries of psychic and spiritual reality, which these investigators are not equipped to handle. The richness of scriptural and patristic knowledge precisely of this latter reality places Orthodox Christian observer in a uniquely advantageous position from which to evaluate these new hypotheses and the UFO phenomena in general. The Orthodox Christian observer, however, is less interested in the phenomena themselves than he is in the mentality associated with them. How are people commonly interpreting UFOs and why? Among the first approach to the UFO question in this matter, in a serious study, was renowned Swiss psychologist C.G. Jung, who, in his book 1959, Flying Saucers, A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Skies, he approached the phenomena as primarily something psychological and religious in meaning. And although something psychological and although he himself did not attempt to identify them as objective reality, he nonetheless did grasp the realm of human knowledge to which they actually belong. Today's investigators, while starting from the objective and not psychological side of the question, have also found it necessary to put forth the psychic hypotheses to explain the phenomena. In approaching the religious and psychological side of the UFO phenomena, it is important for us, first of all, to understand the background in terms of which flying saucers have generally been interpreted by those who believe in their existence from the time of their first appearance in the 1940s. What were men prepared to see in the sky? The answer to this question may be found in the brief look at the literature of popular science fiction. The spirit of science fiction. Historians of science fiction usually trace the origins of the literary form back to the early 19th century. Some prefer to see it at the beginning of short stories of Edgar Allan Poe, which combine the persuasive realism and style with the subject matter always tinged with the mysterious and occult. Others see the first science fiction writer in Poe's English contemporary Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, wife of the famous poet. Her Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, combines fantastical science with occultism in a way characteristic of many science fiction stories since then. The typical science fiction story, however, was to come with the late 19th and early 20th centuries, from Jules Verne and H.G. Wells to our own days. From largely second-rate form of literature in the American periodical pulps of the 1930s and 1940s, science fiction has come of age and become a respectable international literary form in recent decades. In addition, a number of extremely popular motion pictures have shown how much the spirit of science fiction has captivated the modern imagination. The cheaper and more sensational fiction movies of the 1950s have given way in the last decade or so to the fashionable idea movies like 2001: A Space Odyssey, Star Wars, and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, not to mention one of the most popular and long-lived American television series, Star Trek. The spirit of science fiction is derived from an underlying philosophy of our ideology, more often implied than expressed in so many words, which is shared by virtually all those who create in science fiction forms. This philosophy may be summed up in the following main points. 1. Religion, in the traditional sense, is absent, or else present in a very incidental or artificial way. The literary form itself is obviously a product of the post-Christian age, evident already in the stories of Poe and Shelley. The science fiction universe is a totally secular one, although often with mystical overtones of an occult or Eastern kind. God, if mentioned at all, is a vague and impersonal power, not a personal being. For example, the Force in Star Wars, a cosmic energy that has its evil as well as good side. The increasing fascination of contemporary man with science fiction themes is a direct reflection of the loss of traditional religious values. 2. The center of science fiction universe, in place of the absent God, is man. Not usually man as he is now, but man as he will become in the future, in accordance with the modern mythology of evolution. Although the heroes of science fiction stories are usually recognizable humans, the story interest often centers about their encounters with various kinds of Superman from highly evolved races of the future, or sometimes the past, or from distant galaxies. The idea of the possibility of highly evolved intelligent life on other planets has become so much part of contemporary mentality that even respectable scientific and semi-scientific speculations assume it as a matter of course. Thus, one of the popular series of books, Erlich von Daniken, Chariots of the Gods, Gods from Outer Space, finds supposed evidence of the presence of extraterrestrial beings or gods in ancient history, who are supposedly responsible for the sudden appearance of intelligence in them, difficult to account for by usual evolutionary theory. Serious scientists in the Soviet Union speculate that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was due to a nuclear explosion rather that extraterrestrial beings visited Earth centuries ago, that Jesus Christ may have been a cosmonaut, and today we may be on the threshold of the second coming of intelligent beings from outer space. Sheila Ostrander and Lynn Schroeder in Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain, Bantam Books, 1977. See articles in Russian, Dr. Vyacheslav Zaitsev, Visitors from Outer Space in Sputnik, January 1967, and Temples and Spaceships in Sputnik, January 1968. Equally serious scientists in the West think the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence is likely enough that for at least 18 years they have been trying to establish contact with them by means of radio telescopes, and currently there are at least 6 searches being conducted by astronomers around the world for intelligent radio signals from space. Contemporary Protestant and Roman Catholic theologians, who have become accustomed to follow whatever science seems to be leading, speculate in the new realm of exotheology, or the theology of outer space, concerning what nature of the extraterrestrial races might have. See Time magazine, April 24, 1978. It can hardly be denied that the myth behind science fiction has a powerful fascination even among many learned men of our day. The future evolved beings in science fiction literature are invariably seen as having outgrown the limitations of present-day humanity, in particular the limitations of personality. Like the god of science fiction, man also had become strangely impersonal. In Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End, the new race of humans has the appearance of children, but faces devoid of personality. They are about to be they are about to be guided into yet higher evolutionary transformations, on the way to becoming absorbed in the impersonal overmind. In general, the literature of science fiction, in direct contrast to Christianity, but exactly in accordance with some schools of Eastern thought, sees evolutionary advancement in spirituality in terms of increased impersonality. 3. The future world and humanity are seen by science fiction ostensibly in terms of projections from present-day scientific discoveries. In actuality, however, these projections correspond quite remarkably to the everyday reality of occult and overtly demonic experience throughout the ages. Among the characteristics of the highly evolved creatures of the future are communication by mental telepathy, ability to fly, materialize and dematerialize, transform the appearances of things, or create illusionary scenes and creatures by pure thought, travel at speed far beyond any modern technology, to take possession of bodies of earthmen, and the expounding of spiritual philosophy, which is beyond all religions and holds promise of a state where advanced intelligences will no longer be dependent on matter. All of these standard practices and claims of sorcerers and demons. A recent history of science fiction notes that a persistent aspect of the vision of science fiction is the desire to transcend normal experience. There's the presentation of characters and events that transgress the conditions of space and time as we know them. That is Robert Scholes and Eric C. S. Radkin in Science Fiction History, Science Vision, Oxford University Press, 1977. The scripts of Star Trek and other science fiction stories, with their futuristic scientific devices, read in parts like excerpts from the lives of ancient Orthodox saints, where the actions of sorcerers are described at a time when sorcery was still a strong part of pagan life. Science fiction in general is usually not very scientific at all, and not really very futuristic either. If anything, it is a retreat to the mystical origins of modern science. It is a science before the ages of 17th and 18th century Enlightenment, which is much closer to occultism. The same history of science fiction remarks that the roots of science fiction, like the roots of science itself, are in magic and mythology. Present-day research and experiments in parapsychology point also to a future connection of science with occultism, a development which science fiction literature is in full harmony. Science fiction in the Soviet Union, where it is just as popular as it is in the West, although its development has been a little different, has exactly the same themes as Western science fiction. In general, metaphysical themes in Soviet science fiction, which labors under the watchful eye of materialistic censors, comes from the influence of Western writers or from direct Hindu influence, as in the case of the writer Ivan Efremov. The reader of Soviet science fiction, according to one critic, emerges with a vague ability to distinguish the critical demarcation between science and magic, between scientist and sorcerer, between future and fantasy. Science fiction, both East and West, says the same writer, like other aspects of contemporary culture, all confirm the fact that the higher stage of humanism is occultism. G.V. Grebens, Ivan Efremov's Theory of Soviet Science Fiction, Vantage Press, 1978, pages 108-110. Almost by its very nature as futuristic, science fiction tends to be utopian. Few novels or stories actually describe a future perfect society, but most of them deal with the evolution of today's society into something higher, or the encounter with an advanced civilization on another planet, with the hope or capability of overcoming today's problems and mankind's limitations in general. In Efremov's and other Soviet science fiction, communism itself becomes cosmic and begins to acquire non-materialistic qualities, and the post-industrial civilization will be Hindu-like. The advanced beings of outer space are often endowed with savior-like qualities, and the landings of spacecraft on Earth often herald the apocalyptic events, usually the arrival of benevolent beings to guide men in their evolutionary advancement. In a word, the science fiction literature of the 20th century is itself a clear sign of the loss of Christian values and Christian interpretation of the world. It has become a powerful vehicle for the dissemination of non-Christian philosophy of life and history, largely under open or concealed occult and Eastern influence. And in a Christian time of crisis and transition in human civilization, it has been a prime force in creating the hope and actual expectation of visitors from outer space who will solve mankind's problems and conduct man to a new cosmic age of its history. While appearing to be scientific and non-religious, science fiction literature is in actuality a leading propagator in secular form of the new religious consciousness which is sweeping mankind as Christianity retreats. All of this is a necessary background for the discussion of the actual manifestation of unidentified flying objects, which strangely correspond to the pseudo-religious expectations which have been aroused in post-Christian man. UFO sightings and scientific investigation of them. Although science fiction, one might say, has in a way prepared men for the appearance of UFOs, our understanding of their objective reality obviously cannot be derived from literature or human expectations or fantasies. Before we can understand what they might be, we must know something of the nature and reliability of the observations which have been made of them. Is there something out there in the sky, or is the phenomenon entirely a matter of misperception on the one hand and psychological and pseudo-religious wish fulfillment on the other? A reliable outline of UFO phenomena has been given by Dr. Jacques Vallée, a French scientist now living in California, who has advanced degrees in astrophysics and computer science, and has been involved in scientific analyses of UFO reports for many years. His testimony is all the more valuable to us in that he has studied closely UFO sightings outside the United States, especially in France, and thus able to give a fair international picture of their distribution. Dr. Vallée finds UFOs in Space, Anatomy of a Phenomenon, Ballantine Books, New York, 1977, first published by Henry Regenery Company, 1965, that although strange flying objects have been observed at various times in past centuries, their modern history as a mass phenomenon begins in the years during the just after World War II. American interest began with the sightings in 1947, but there were a number of sightings before that in Europe. In World War II, many pilots reported strange lights and seemed to be under intelligent control. And in 1946, particularly in July, there were a whole series of sightings in Sweden and other North European countries. Sightings in the Scandinavian wave were interpreted first as meteors, then as rockets, or as ghost rockets, or bombs, and finally as some new type of aircraft capable of extraordinary movements in the sky, but leaving no trace on the ground, even when they seemed to land. The European press was full of reports of this wave of sightings, and everyone in Sweden was talking about them. Thousands of sightings were reported, but not once was the hypothesis of extraterrestrial or interplanetary origin suggested. Dr. Vallée suggested the wave was caused by actually existing but unidentified objects, and not by any previously existing UFO rumor or expectations of visitors from outer space. In this and succeeding saucer waves, he finds a total absence of any correlation between widespread interest in science fiction and peaks of UFO activity. Earlier, also, there had been no saucer wave at the time of the American panic over Orson Welles' 1938 adaptation of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. He concludes that the birth, growth, and expansion of a UFO wave is an objective phenomenon independent of conscious and unconscious influence of the witnesses and their reactions to it. The first publicized sighting in the United States occurred in June 1947 when Kenneth Arnold, a salesman flying his own plane, saw 9 disc-like objects looking something like saucers flying near Mount Rainier in Washington state. The newspaper picked up the story and the flying saucer era began. Interestingly, however, this was not actually the first American sighting at all. Other unpublicized sightings have been made in the months before this. There was also a UFO wave with 50 reports in Hungary early in June. Therefore, the 1947 sightings cannot be all set down to hysteria over the Arnold incident. There were a number of other sightings in the American wave of 1947, chiefly in June, July, and August. Although some newspapers speculated on the interplanetary visitors, these sightings were taken seriously by scientists who assumed they were as a result of advanced human technology, most likely American or perhaps Russian in origin. A second wave occurred in July 1948, with sightings in America and France. In the United States, there was a spectacular night sighting made by the pilots of Eastern Airlines DC-3 plane of a torpedo-shaped craft with 2 rows of portholes surrounded by a blue glow with a tail of orange flames, which maneuvered to avoid collision and disappeared. In August of the same year, there were so many sightings in Saigon and other parts of Southeast Asia of long fish-like objects. 1949 saw reports of strange disks and spheres in Sweden and more UFOs in America, including 2 observations by trained astronomical observers. Small UFO waves as well as isolated sightings continued in 1950 and 1951, especially in the United States, but also in Europe. In 1952, the first real international UFO wave occurred, with many sightings in the United States, France, and North Africa. At the peak of the wave, 2 sensational sightings were made above the Capitol of the White House in Washington, D.C., an area under constant control by radar. In September, there were there was a wave encompassing Denmark, Sweden, and northern Germany and Poland. At the same time in France, the first UFO landing was reported, together with a description of little men. In 1953, there were no waves, but there was a number of individual sightings. The most remarkable one occurred in Bismarck, North Dakota, where 4 objects hovered and maneuvered over an air filter station for 3 hours at night. An official report of this event consisted of several hundred pages, which accounts for many witnesses, mainly pilots and military personnel. In 1954 saw the largest international wave yet. France was literally inundated with sightings, with dozens of reports every day in September, October, and November. In the French wave, the problems facing a serious scientific investigation of UFO phenomena are well demonstrated. The phenomenon was so intense, the impact of public opinion so deep, the newspaper reactions so emotional, the scientific reflexes were saturated long before serious investigation could be organized. As a result, no scientist could risk his reputation by studying openly a phenomenon so emotionally distorted. French scientists remained silent until the wave passed and died. During the French wave, the typical characteristics of later UFO encounters were often present. UFO landing, with at least some circumstantial evidence of them, beams of light issuing from UFO to the witnesses, stoppage of motors in the vicinity of sightings, strange small beings in diving suits, serious psychic and physical harm to witnesses. Since 1954, many sightings have been made every year in various countries, with major international waves in 1965, 1967, 1972, 1973. Sightings have been especially numerous and profound in their effects in South American countries. The best-known government investigation of UFOs was that undertaken by the United States Air Force shortly after the first American sightings in 1947. This investigation, known from 1951 as Project Blue Book, lasted until 1969, when it was abandoned on the recommendation of the Condon Report of 1968, the work of a scientific committee led by noted physicists of the University of Colorado. Close observers of both the Blue Book and the Condon Committee, however, have noted that neither of them took the UFO phenomena seriously, that their main occupation was more in public relations task of explaining away mystifying aerial phenomena in order to calm public fears about them. Some flying saucer groups claim the United States government was using these investigations as a cover-up of its own knowledge of the real nature of UFOs. But all evidence points to the fact that these investigations themselves were simply careless because the phenomena were not taken seriously, especially after some of the stranger UFO stories have begun to make subject distasteful to scientists. The first director of the Blue Book, Captain Edward Ruppelt, admitted that if the Air Force tried to throw up a screen of confusion, they couldn't have done a better job. The problem was tackled with organized confusion. Everything was being evaluated on the premise that UFOs couldn't exist. Ruppelt reported on unidentified flying objects, Ace Books, New York, 1956. The Condon Report contains some classic explanations of UFOs. One, for example, states that this unusual sighting should therefore be assigned to the category of some almost certainly natural phenomenon which is so rare that it appears really has never been reported before or since. The chief scientific consultant of Blue Book for the most of its 22 years, Northwestern University astronomer J. Allen Hynek, openly calls the whole thing a pseudoscientific project. Hynek, The UFO Experience, A Scientific Inquiry, Ballantine Books, New York, 1977. In 22 years of investigations, such as they were, Project Blue Book collected over 12,000 cases of puzzling aerial phenomena, 25% of which remained unidentified, even after its strained explanations. Many thousands of other cases have been and are being collected and investigated by private organizations in the United States and in other countries, although almost all government organizations refrain from commenting on them. In the Soviet Union, the subject was first given public mention, which means government approval, in 1967, when Dr. Felix U. Ziegel of the Moscow Institute of Aviation, in an article in the Soviet magazine Smena, stated, "The Soviet radar has picked up unidentified flying objects for over 20 years. UFOs, what are they?" in Smena April 27, 1967. See also his article, Unidentified Flying Objects in Soviet Life, February 1968, Ostrander and Schroeder, Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain, pages 94 to 103. At the same time, there was a Soviet scientific conference on space civilizations, led by Armenian astronomer Victor Ambartsumyan, which urged a preliminary study of the scientific and technical problems of communicating with such civilizations whose existence is taken for granted. Felix Ziegel on the possible exchange of information with extraterrestrial civilizations, paper presented at All Union Engineering Institute of Moscow on March 13, 1967, Psychic Discoveries, page 96. The next year, however, the subject of UFOs became once more forbidden in the Soviet Union, and since then, Soviet scientists have been told their researches and hypotheses only unofficially to Western scientists. In the United States, the subject of UFOs remains somewhat off limits for military and scientific men, but in recent years, the increasing number of, especially among younger scientists, have begun to take the subject seriously and come together to discuss it and suggest means of researching it. Dr. Hynek and Vallée speak of an invisible college of scientists who are now actively interested in the UFO phenomena, although most of them do not wish their names publicly associated with the subject. There are, of course, those who continue to deny the phenomenon altogether, explaining it as misperceptions of natural objects, balloons, airplanes, etc., not to mention hoaxes and psychological projections. One of these, Philip Klass, takes delight in debunking UFOs, investigating some of the sightings and finding them to be either natural phenomena or frauds. His study has convinced him that the idea of wondrous spaceships from a distant civilization really is a fairy story that is tailored to the adult mentality. Philip J. Klass, UFOs Explained, by Random House, New York, 1974. Such hard-headed investigators, however, usually restrict themselves to cases where actual physical proof of UFOs have been left, the so-called close encounters of the second kind, as we shall see below. And even staunch defenders of their reality are forced to admit that there is very little of this even in the most convincing UFO sightings. That one thing has persuaded a number of scientists in recent years to take the phenomena seriously is not the physical proof of them, but the fact that many serious and reliable people have seen something which cannot be explained, which has a powerful effect upon them. Dr. Hynek writes in his investigation, invariably I have had the feeling that I was talking to someone who was describing a very real event. To him or her, it represented an outstanding experience, vivid and not at all dreamlike, an event for which the observer was usually totally unprepared, something soon recognized as being beyond comprehension, a UFO experience. This combination is often intense reality of the experience of encountering a UFO, especially in the close encounters, and almost total lack of physical evidence of it. Makes the investigation of UFO by nature not chiefly an examination of physical phenomena, but more an investigation of human reports of it, their credibility, consistency, etc. Already this places into the investigation somewhat in the realm of psychology, and is enough to tell us about the approach solely in search of physical proof is an inadequate one. However, Mr. Klass's opinion that the wondrous spaceships are a fairy story for adults is perhaps also not far from the truth. One thing is the observations made of UFOs, and quite another is the interpretation which people have given their or others' observations. The former could be real, the latter a fairy story, or a myth of our times. Dr. Hynek has done much to remove some of the common misconceptions about UFO sightings. Thus, he makes it clear that most UFO sightings are not reported by cultists, unstable, or uneducated people. The few reports made by such people are usually easily identified as unreliable and not further investigated. But the most coherent and articulate reports come from normal, responsible people, often with scientific training, who are genuinely surprised or shocked by their experience and simply don't know how to explain it. The UFO experience. The stronger the experience and the closer the UFO is seen, the less willing the witnesses are to report it at all. UFO records are a collection of incredible tales told by credible persons, as one Air Force general has remarked. There can be no reasonable doubt that there is something behind many thousands of serious UFO reports. I'll be right back. Hi guys. The 6 kinds of UFO encounters. Dr. Hynek, who has studied the question more thoroughly than any other distinguished scientist, has conveniently divided UFO phenomena into 6 general categories. The Hynek UFO Report, Dell Publishing, New York. The first, nocturnal lights, is one of the more commonly reported and the least strange of all. Most of such reports are easily explained as heavenly bodies, meteors, etc., and are not considered UFOs. Truly puzzling nocturnal lights, those that remain unidentified, which seem to display intelligent action, but are not explainable, as ordinary aircraft, are often seen by multiple witnesses, including police officers, airplane pilots, and airport tower operators. The second category of UFO is daylight discs, whose behavior is close to that of nocturnal lights. These are the original flying saucers, and in fact, most of all unidentified sightings in this category are of discs, which are vary in shape from circular to cigar-shaped. They are often metallic in appearance and are often reported as capable of extremely rapid starts and stops at high speed, as well as maneuvers such as sudden reversals of direction and motionless hovering that are beyond the capacity of any present aircraft. There are many purported photographs of such discs, but none of them is very convincing, owing to the distance involved and the possibility of trick photography. Like nocturnal lights, UFOs in this category are almost always reported as being totally noiseless, and sometimes 2 or more of them are seen. The third category is that of radar visual reports. That is, radar sightings that are confirmed by independent visual observation, radar by itself being subject to various kinds of misperceptions. Most of these cases occur at night, and the best cases involve simultaneous sightings by airplanes, sometimes purposely dispatched to follow the UFO, at fairly close range. In these cases, the UFO always outmaneuvers the airplane and sometimes following it and finally disappears in a burst of speed to 4,000 miles and more per hour. Sometimes, as in categories 1 and 2, the object also seems to divide and become 2 or more distinct objects, and sometimes clear visual sightings of such objects by pilots in the air are not picked up by radar at all. Sightings in this category, just as the first 2, last from between a few minutes to several hours. A number of cases in the first 3 categories are well documented, with a number of reliable, experienced, independent witnesses. Still, any one case, as Dr. Hynek notes, might be caused by some extraordinary, unusual set of circumstances and not by some new and totally unknown phenomenon. But when many well-documented cases, all similar to each other, accumulate, the chances that these are all unusual misperceptions of familiar objects becomes very small. This is why serious UFO investigators are now concentrating on the collection of a number of well-documented cases, and the comparison of numbers of reliable testimonies already begins to show definite patterns of UFO activity. The emotional response of those who have witnessed UFOs in the first 3 categories is one of simple perplexity and puzzlement. They have seen something whose behavior seems totally unexplainable, and they are left with tantalizing desire to just see it just a little closer. Only in a few cases, generally involving pilots who have tried to pursue the unidentified objects, has something like real fear has been experienced at the encounters with something that seems intelligently directed and possessed in a technology in advance of anything known today. In cases involving close encounters, on the other hand, the human response becomes much deeper and the psychic side of the phenomena are more pronounced. Close encounters of the first kind are sightings of a luminous object at close range, about 500 feet or less, the light being sometimes very bright and casting luminescence on the ground below. When the shape of the object is described, it is generally stated to be oval, sometimes with a dome on top, and the lights are often described as rotating, usually in a counterclockwise direction. The objects are often hover close to the ground without a sound, or occasionally with a humming sound, sometimes moving close to the ground over considerable distances and eventually taking off extremely rapidly, soundlessly, and usually straight up. There are numerous multiple witness accounts of such close encounters. These accounts are invariably quite similar to each other, as though it is indeed one and the same object, or similar objects, that is being observed in a well-documented cases. Typically, these cases occur at night in sparsely settled areas, and these are a small number of witnesses of each sighting. The average of 3 to 4 in the cases examined by Dr. Hynek. Close encounters of the first kind are always awesome and often frightening, but leaves no visible marks. Witnesses are usually so overwhelmed by the experience that they neglect to take photographs of the object, even when a camera is nearby. Typical of the effect on witnesses is this comment in the 1955 UFO report. I can assure you, once anyone has seen an object such as this so closely, and for this period of even 1 minute, it would be etched into their memory for all time. The Hynek UFO report, page 145. The experience is so unusual that witnesses are often not believed when they report it, a fact that causes many to report it only confidentially after many years or not at all. The experience is intensely real to those who experience it, but largely unbelievable to others. A typical close encounter of the first kind involves two Portage County, Ohio deputy sheriffs in 1966. About 5 a.m. on the morning of April 16, after stopping to investigate a parked car on a country road, they saw an object as big as a house ascending to treetop level, about 100 feet. As it approached the deputies, it became increasingly bright, illuminating the area all around, and stopped and hovered over them with a humming sound. But when it moved away, it pursued it for some 70 miles into Pennsylvania at a speed of up to 105 miles per hour. Two other police officers saw the object clearly at a higher elevation before it went straight up and disappeared about dawn. Congressional pressure forced Project Blue Book to investigate this case. It was explained as an observation of Venus, and the officers who saw it were subjected to considerable ridicule in the press, leading to the breakup of one officer's family and the ruin of his health and career. Personal tragedies of this kind among people who have close encounters with UFOs are so common that they should definitely be included in the typical characteristics of this phenomenon. Close encounters of the second kind are essentially similar to CE1 experiences, with one difference that they leave the striking physical and/or psychological effect of their presence. These effects include marks on the ground, scorching or blighting of plants and trees, interference with electrical circuits causing radio static and stoppage of automobile engines, discomfort of animals as evidenced by strange behavior, and effects on humans which include temporary paralysis or numbness, a feeling of heat, nausea, or other discomfort, temporary weightlessness, sometimes causing levitation, sudden healing of sores and pains, and various psychological and physical after effects, including strange marks on the body. This includes a UFO encounter gives the greatest possibility for scientific investigation, since in addition to human testimony, there is a physical evidence that can be examined. But little investigation has actually been undertaken, both because most scientists are afraid to get involved in the whole question of UFOs, and because the evidence itself is usually inconclusive or partially subjective. One catalog has been compiled of over 800 cases of this type in 24 countries, the Hynek UFO report. No actual piece of UFO has been authenticated. However, the markings left on the ground are often baffling as the sightings themselves. The most frequent markings left on the ground after sightings, the UFO itself having been either on the ground or just above it, is a burnt, dehydrated, or depressed area in the shape of a ring, usually 20-30 feet in diameter, 1 to 3 feet thick. These rings persist for weeks or months in the interior of the ring, sometimes the whole circle. It is reported to be barren for a season or two after sighting. A few chemical analyses of the soil in such rings have produced no definitive conclusions to the possible origin of the condition. Close encounters of the second kind often happen to persons during the night in isolated sections of road. In many similar cases, a glowing object lands in the field nearby or on the road in front of an automobile or truck. The engine of the headlights or automobile fail, and occupants become terrified until the UFO leaves, often shooting suddenly straight up without a sound. The engine of the vehicle then can operate again and often comes on by itself. The strangest of all UFO reports are the type that deal with close encounters of the third kind, CE3, that is, UFO experiences involving animated being, occupants, or humanoids. The first thought of many people who, in hearing such reports, is to picture little green men and dismiss the whole phenomenon as unbelievable, a hoax or a hallucination. However, the success of recent American science fiction film, named precisely for this category of UFO phenomena, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, for which Dr. Hynek served as a technical consultant, together with evidence of the Gallup poll in 1974 that 54% of those who are aware of UFOs believe that they are real, 46 are all of those in for you believe the intelligent life on other planets, in the Edge of Reality, a progress report of unidentified flying objects, Henry Regnery Company in Chicago, 1975. The percentage today would certainly be greater. Point to the rapidly increasing acceptance by contemporary men of the possibility of actual encounters with non-human intelligences. Science fiction has given the images, evolution has produced a philosophy, and the technology of the space age has supplied plausibility for such encounters. Astonishingly, these encounters seem to actually be occurring today, as attested by the evidence of many believable witnesses. Of crucial importance, therefore, is the interpretation that must be made of these occurrences. Is the reality behind them an actual contact with visitors from outer space, or is this only an explanation provided by the spirit of the times for a contact of a different kind altogether? As we shall see below, today's scientific investigators of UFOs have already been asked these questions. Dr. Hynek admits his own repugnance to the face of possibility of CE3 experiences. To be frank, I would gladly omit this part if I could without offense to scientific integrity. The UFO Experience, page 158. However, since his aim is scientific objectivity, he finds it impossible to ignore the well-documented cases from believable witnesses of this strange phenomenon. Of nearly 1,250 close encounters encountered in catalog by Dr. Jacques Vallée, 750 reports of the landing of a craft, and more than 300 of these humanoids in or about the craft. One-third of all these are multiple witness cases. In one humanoid case, which occurred in November 1961, in one of the northern plains states of USA, four men were returning from a hunting trip late at night when one of the men noticed a flaming object coming down as if it were an airplane crashing about a half-mile from the road from them. When they reached the site of the crash, all four men saw a silo-shaped craft in a field, sticking in the ground at an angle, with four seemingly human figures standing around it. This was at a distance of about 150 yards. They flashed a light on one of the figures, who was about 4.5 feet high, wearing what looked like white coveralls. He made a gesture to the man to stay back. After some hesitation, still thinking it was a plane crash, they went to a nearby town for a police officer, and when they returned, they saw only some small red lights, something like automobile lights. They drove into the field with the officer and followed the lights, only to discover that they suddenly disappeared, leaving no tracks whatsoever, despite the muddiness of the field. After the puzzled police officer left, the men again saw the silo coming down out of the sky with a reddish glow. Instantly, after the object landed, two figures were visible next to it. A shot was fired, although none of the men admitted to firing it, and one of the figures was hit in the shoulder with a thud and spin around and down to his knees. In panic, the men ran to their car and raced off, agreeing among themselves not to mention the incident to anyone. They returned home with a strange feeling that there was some period of time lost during the night. The next day, one of the men was visited at his work by several well-groomed, official-looking men who asked him questions about the incident, but without mentioning the shooting, and then took him in their car to his home, where they questioned him about his clothes and boot, and then left, telling him not to say anything about the incident to anyone. The hunter assumed these men were the United States Air Force, investigators trying to conceal some new secret device, but the men never identified themselves and never contacted him again. All four men were extremely shaken up by the incident, and after 6 years, one of them felt compelled to tell the whole story to a U.S. Treasury agent. Edge of Reality, page 129. The main incidents of the story are typical of many close encounters of the third kind. A little different case of this sort was the infamous UFO landing at Kelly, a small town near Hopkinsville, Kentucky, which was investigated extensively by the police, Air Force, and independent researchers. In the evening of the night of August 21st, 1955, 7 adults and 4 children in one farm household had a prolonged encounter with humanoids. The incident began at 7 o'clock. When a teenage son of the family saw a flying object land behind the farmhouse. No one believed him, but an hour later, a little man, emitting a strange glow, came walking toward the house with his hands raised. Two of the men in the house, out of fear, shot at the creature when it was 20 feet away. It somersaulted and disappeared in the dark. Soon another similar creature appeared at a window, then again fired at it, and again it disappeared. Going outside, the men shot at another creature with a claw-like hand which they saw on the roof. Still another on a tree nearby floated on the ground when it was shot. Other creatures who were also seen and hit, or perhaps the same creatures reappearing, but then men saw the bullets seem to ricochet off them and have no real effect. The sound was like shooting into a bucket. After firing 4 boxes of shells with no effect, all 11 people, thoroughly terrified, drove to the Hopkinsville police station. The police arrived at the farmhouse after midnight and made thorough search of the premises, finding a few unusual markings and seeing several strange meteors. They came in the direction of the farmhouse, but discovering no creatures. After the police left, the creatures reappeared, causing more consternation in the household. The humanoids in this case were described as being 3 to 4 feet tall, with huge hands and eyes, without pupils or eyelids, large pointed ears, and arms that hung to the ground. They seemed to have no clothing but to be nickel-plated. They approached the house always from the darkest side, and did not approach when outside lights were turned on. Vali, UFOs in Space. Hynek, the UFO Experience. Dr. Hynek sharply distinguishes between close encounters of the third kind and contactee cases. Contactees have repeated encounters with UFO beings, often bringing pseudo-religious messages from them about highly evolved beings on other planets who are about to come up to bring peace on Earth, and are often connected with UFO religious cults. Ordinary CE3 encounters, on the other hand, are in general very similar to other close encounters, and occur to people of similar occupations and reliability, are just as unexpected, and produce the same kind of shock at the sight of something so unbelievable. The occupants, who are seen, usually from a little distance, are often reported as picking up samples of earth and rocks, showing a seeming interest in human installation and vehicles, or repairing their own craft. The humanoids are described as having large heads with largely non-human features, no eyes or large eyes widely spaced, small or no nose, a bare slit for a mouth, spindly legs, no neck. Some are reported to be human size, others about 3 feet high, as in the Kelly Hopkinsville incident. Recently, a new catalog of over 1,000 CE3 cases has been compiled. There have been a number of cases seriously reported by seemingly reliable people of abductions by UFO occupants, usually for the purposes of testing. Almost all evidence of these cases, if we exclude contactees, has been obtained by regressive hypnosis. The experience is so traumatic to the witnesses that the conscious mind does not remember it, and it is only some time later that such people agree to be hypnotized in order to explain some mysterious time loss in connection to their close encounter experience, the first part of which they do remember. One of the best-known abduction cases occurred at about midnight on September 19, 1961, near Whitfield, New Hampshire. It was made the subject of a book by John Fuller, The Interrupted Journey, which was printed in a condensed form in Look magazine. On this night, Barney and Betty Hill were returning from a vacation trip when they saw a descending UFO which landed right in front of their car on the side road. Some humanoids approached them, and the next thing they remembered was 2 hours later they were 35 miles further down the road. The amnesia bothered them, leading to physical and mental disorders, and they finally went to a psychiatrist. Under hypnosis, they both independently related that they had what happened during the missing time. Both stated they had been taken aboard a craft by the humanoids and given physical examinations, with samples taken of fingernails and skin. They were released after being given hypnotic suggestion that they will remember nothing of the experience. Under hypnosis, the related experience was great emotional disturbance. In a similar case, at 2:30 a.m. on December 3, 1967, a policeman in Ashland, Nebraska, saw an object with a row of flickering lights in the road, which took off in the air when he approached it. He reported a flying saucer to his superiors and went home with a strong headache, a buzzing noise in his ears, and a red welt across his below his left ear. Later, it was discovered that there had been a period of 20 minutes that night of which he remembered nothing. Under hypnosis, he revealed that he had followed the UFO which had landed. The occupants flashed a bright light at him and then took him aboard the craft when he saw control panels and computer-like machines. An engineer in France had seen something similar when he was abducted for 18 days. The humanoids wearing coveralls with winged serpent emblem told the policemen that they came from a nearby galaxy, had bases in the United States, and operated their craft by reverse electromagnetism. They contact people by chance and want to puzzle them. They release the man, telling him not to speak wisely about the night. At first sight, such incidents seem simply unbelievable, like some strange cases of hallucination or distorted imagination, but there have been too many of them now to dismiss them quite so easily. As reports of encounters with actual physical aircraft, to be sure, they are not very convincing. Further, psychiatrists themselves caution that the results of regressive hypnosis are very uncertain. The person being hypnotized is often not capable of distinguishing between actual experiences and suggestions planted in the mind, whether by a hypnotist or by someone else at the time of supposed close encounter. But even if these experiences are not fully real, an objective phenomena in space and time, the very fact that so many of them have been implanted in human minds in recent years is already significant enough. Without a doubt, there is something behind abduction experiences also, and a result of UFO investigators have begun to look for different directions for an explanation of them. Such experiences, and especially the close encounters of the 1970s, are noticeably bound up in paranormal or occult phenomena. People sometimes have strange dreams just before seeing UFOs, or hear knocks on the door when no one is there, or have strange visitors afterwards. Some witnesses receive telepathic messages from UFO occupants. UFOs now sometimes simply materialize and dematerialize instead of coming and going at great speeds. Sometimes miraculous healings occur in their presence, or one is exposed to their light. But close encounters with UFOs have also resulted in leukemia and radiation sickness. Often there are tragic psychological effects, personality deterioration, insanity, and suicide. The increase in the psychic component of UFO sightings has led researchers to seek similarities between UFO experiences and occult phenomena, and to seek the key to understanding UFOs and the psychic effects they produce. Many researchers note the similarity between UFO phenomena and 19th century Spiritism, which also combines psychic phenomena with strange physical effects, but with more primitive technology. In general, the 1970s have seen a narrowing of the gap between normal UFO phenomenon of the past, of the UFO cults, in accordance with increased receptivity of mankind in the decade of occult practices. I'll be right back. The explanation of the UFO phenomena. Dr. Jacques Vallée's newest book on UFOs, The Invisible College, reveals what reputable scientific researchers are now thinking about them. He believes that we are now very close to understanding what they are. He notes that the idea of extraterrestrial intelligent life has, in few years, become astonishingly fashionable among scientists as well as fortune tellers as a result of the great thirst for contact with a superior mind that will provide guidance for our poor, harassed, hectic planet. He significantly sees the idea of visitors from outer space has been the great myth or wonderful untruth of our times. It has been very important for a large number of people to expect visitors from outer space. Yet he finds it naive to believe in this myth. The explanation is too simple-minded to account for the diversity of the reported behavior for the occupants of their perceived interaction with human beings. Dr. Hynek has noted that in order to explain the various effects produced by UFOs, we must assume that they are a phenomenon that undoubtedly has physical effects but has also attributes of the psychic world. Dr. Vallee believes that they are constructed both as physical craft, a fact which has long appeared to me undeniable, and as psychic devices whose exact properties remain to be defined. Actually, the theory that UFOs are not physical craft at all, but become kind of paraphysical or psychic phenomena was suggested by a number of researchers in the early 1950s. But this subject was largely submerged later, on the one hand by the cultists with their insistence on the extraterrestrial origin of UFOs, and on the other hand by official government explanations, which corresponded to widespread popular view of the whole phenomenon was imaginary. Kiel UFOs, Operation Trojan Horse. Only lately have serious investigators begun to agree that UFOs, while having certain physical characteristics, cannot at all be explained as somebody's spaceships, but are clearly something of the paraphysical or occult realm. Why indeed are so many UFO landings precisely in the middle of roads? Why do such fantastically advanced craft so often need repairs? Why do the occupants so often need to pick up rocks and sticks over and over again for 25 years to test so many people if there are actually reconnaissance vehicles from another planet, as the humanoids usually claim? Dr. Vallee well asks whether the visitors from outer space idea might not serve precisely the diversionary role in masking the real, infinitely more complex nature of the technology that gives rise to these sightings. He believes we're not dealing with successive waves of visitation from space. We are dealing with a control system. What takes place through close encounters with UFOs is in control of human beliefs. With every new wave of UFOs, the social impact becomes greater. More young people become fascinated with space, with psychic phenomena, with new frontiers in consciousness. More books and articles appear, changing our culture. In another book, he notes that it is possible to make large sections of any population believe in the existence of supernatural races, in the possibility of flying machines, in the plurality of inhabited worlds, by exposing them to a few carefully engineered scenes, the detail of which are adapted to the culture and superstitions of a particular time and place. Valley, Passport to Magonia, Henry Regency Company, Chicago, 1969. An important clue to the meaning of these engineered scenes may be scenes in an observation often made by careful observers of UFO phenomena, especially CE3 and the contactee cases, that they are profoundly absurd or contain at least as much absurdity as rationality. Individual close encounters have absurd details like 4 pancakes given by UFO occupant to a Wisconsin chicken farmer in 1961. One of the pancakes was actually analyzed by the Food and Drug Laboratory of the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare and was found to be of terrestrial origin. More significantly, the encounters themselves are strangely pointless, without clear purpose or meaning. A Pennsylvania psychiatrist has suggested that the absurdity present in almost all UFO close encounters is actually hypnotic technique. When the person is disturbed by the absurd or contradictory, their mind is searching for meaning, they are extremely open to thought transference, to receiving psychic healing, etc. Dr. Voli compares this technique to the irrational koans of Zen masters and notices a similarity between UFO encounters and occult initiation rituals which open the mind to a new set of symbols. All of this points to what calls the next form of religion. Thus, UFO encounters are to be a contemporary form of an occult phenomenon which has existed throughout centuries. Men have abandoned Christianity and looked for saviors from outer space, and therefore the phenomenon supplies images of spacecraft and space beings. But what is this phenomenon? Who is doing the engineering? And to what purpose? Today, investigators have already supplied the answers to at least first two questions, although being without competence in the realm of religious phenomena, they do not fully understand the significance of what they have found. One investigator, Brad Steiger, an Iowa College professor who has written several books on the subject, often after a recent detailed study of the Air Force Blue Book files, concluded, "We're dealing with a multidimensional paraphysical phenomenon which is largely indigenous to planet Earth." Canadian UFO Report, summer 1977. Doctors Hynek and Voli have advanced the hypothesis of Earth-bound aliens to account for UFO phenomena and speculate the interlocking universes right here on Earth from which they might come. Much less poltergeists produce physical effects while remaining themselves invisible. John Keel, who began his UFO investigation as a skeptic, is himself an agnostic in religion, writes, "The real UFO story is one of ghosts and phantoms and strange mental aberrations, of an invisible world which surrounds us and occasionally engulfs us. It is a world of illusion, where reality itself is distorted by strange forces which can seemingly manipulate space, time, and physical matter, forces which are almost entirely beyond our powers of comprehension. The UFO manifestation seem to be, by and large, merely minor variations of the age-old demonological phenomenon, UFOs, Operation Trojan Horse." In recent bibliography of UFO phenomena prepared by the Library of Congress for the United States Air Force Office of Scientific Research, the introduction states that many of the UFO reports now being published in popular press recount alleged incidents that are strikingly similar to demonic possession and psychic phenomena, which have long been known to theologians and parapsychologists. Lynn G. Guiteau, UFOs and Related Subjects, an Annotated Bibliography. U.S. Government Printing Office, Washington, D.C. Most UFO researchers are now turning to the occult realm and to demonology for insight into the phenomena they are studying. Several recent studies of UFOs by evangelical Protestants put all their evidence together and come to the conclusion that UFO phenomena are simply precisely demonic in origin. Clifford Wilson and John Weldon, Close Encounters, A Better Explanation. Master Books, San Diego, 1978, and Spiritual Counterfeits Project Journal, Berkeley, California, August 1977. UFOs. Is science fiction coming true? The Orthodox Christian investigator can hardly come to a different conclusion. Some or many of the experiences, it may be, are the result of hoaxes or hallucinations, but it's simply impossible to dismiss all of the many thousands of UFO reports this way. A great number of modern mediums and their simplistic phenomena are also fraudulent. But mediumistic spiritism itself, when it is genuine, undeniably produces a real paranormal phenomena under the actions of demons. UFO phenomena having the same source are no less real. Case histories of people who have been drawn into contact with UFOs reveal the standard characteristics which go with involvement with demons in the occult realm. A police officer in Southern California, for example, begins to see UFOs in June 1966, and thereafter saw them frequently, almost always at night. After one landing, he and his wife saw distinct traces of the UFO on the ground. During these weeks of tantalizing sightings, I became totally obsessed with UFOs, convinced that something great was about to happen. I abandoned my daily Bible reading and turned my back on God as I began to read every UFO book I could lay my hands on. Many nights I was watching in vain, trying to mentally communicate with what I thought were extraterrestrial beings, almost praying to them to appear to establish some sort of contact with me. Finally, he had a close encounter with a craft some 80 feet in diameter with rotating white, red, and green lights. It sped off and left him expecting something great to happen. But nothing ever did happen. The UFO ceased appearing, and in his frustration, he turned to alcohol, depression, thoughts of suicide, until his conversion to Christ ended this period of his life. People who have actually contacted the UFO beings have much worse experiences. The beings sometimes literally possess them and try to kill them when they resist. Such cases effectively remind us that quite apart from the meaning of UFO phenomena as a whole, each UFO close encounter has a specific purpose of deceiving the individual who is contacted and leading him, if not to further contacts, to spreading the UFO message, then to at least a personal spiritual confusion and disorientation. The most puzzling aspect of UFO phenomena to most researchers, namely the strange mingling of physical and psychic characteristics in them, is no puzzle at all to readers of Orthodox spiritual books, especially the lives of saints. Demons also have physical bodies, although the matter in them is of such subtlety that it cannot be perceived by men unless their spiritual doors of perception are opened, whether it is with God's will, as in the case of holy men, or against it, as in the case of sorcerers and mediums. The Orthodox doctrine of demons and angels, their manifestations, and the human perception of them is summarized by the great Orthodox father of the 19th century, Bishop Ignatius Bryanchaninov, and set forth in The Soul After Death, St. Herman of Alaska Brotherhood, Plantina, California, 1979. Orthodox literature has many examples of demonic manifestations which fit precisely the UFO pattern. Apparitions of solid beings and objects, whether demons themselves or their illusory creations, which suddenly materialize and dematerialize, always the aim of awing and confusing people and ultimately leading them to perdition. The lives of the 4th century Saint Anthony the Great and 3rd century Saint Cyprian the former sorcerer are filled with such incidents. The life of Saint Martin of Tours by his disciple Sulpicius Severus has an interesting example of demonic power in connection with strange physical manifestations which closely parallels the UFO close encounters. A certain youth named Anatolius became a monk near St. Martin's Monastery, but out of false humility, he became the victim of demonic deception. He fancied that he conversed with angels, and in order to persuade others of his sanctity, these angels agreed to give him a shining robe from out of heaven, as a sign of the power of God that dwelt in the youth. One night, about midnight, there was a tremendous suddening of dancing feet and a murmuring of many voices in the hermitage, and Anatolius' cell became ablaze with light. Then came silence, and the deceived one emerged from his cell with the heavenly garment. A light was brought, and all carefully inspected the garment. It was exceedingly soft, with a surpassing luster and a brilliant scarlet, but it was impossible to tell the nature of the material. At the same time, under the most exact scrutiny of the eyes and fingers, it seems to be a garment and nothing else. The following morning, Anatolius' spiritual father took him by the hand in order to lead him to St. Martin to discover whether it was actually a trick of the devil. In fear, the deceived one refused to go, and when he was being forced to go against his will between the hands of those who were dragging him in the garment disappeared. The author of the account, who either witnessed the incident himself or had it from eyewitnesses, concluded the devil was unable to keep up his illusions or conceal the nature when they were submitted to Martin's eyes. It was so fully within his powers to see the devil that he recognized him under any form, whether he kept his own character or changed himself into any of the various shapes of spiritual wickedness, including the forms of pagan gods and the appearance of Christ himself, with royal robes and crown enveloped in a bright red light. F.R. Hoare, translator, The Western Fathers, Harper Torchback, 1965. It is clear that the manifestations of today's flying saucers are quite within the technology of demons. Indeed, nothing else can explain them as well. The multifarious demonic deceptions of Orthodox literature have been adopted to the mythology of outer space, nothing more. The Anatolius mentioned above would be known simply as a contactee, and the purpose of the unidentified object in such accounts is clear. To all the beholders, the sense of the mysterious, and to produce proof of the higher intelligences, angels, if the victim believes in them, or space visitors for the modern men, and thereby to gain trust of the message they wish to communicate. We shall look at this message below. The demonic kidnapping, quite close to UFO abductions, is described in the life of Saint Nilus of Sora in the 15th century, the Sket life in Russia. Sometime after the saint's death, there lived in his monastery a certain priest with his son. Once when the boy was sent on some errand, suddenly there came to him a certain strange man who seized him and carried him, as if on the wind, into an impenetrable forest, bringing him into a large room in his dwelling, and placing him in the middle of his cabin in front of the window. When the priest and the monks prayed for St. Nilus' help in finding the lost boy, the saint came to the boy's aid and stood before the room where the boy was standing, and when he struck the window frame with his staff, the building was shaken, all the unclean spirits fell to the earth. The saint told the demon to return the boy to his place, he had taken him, and then became invisible. Then, after some howling among the demons, the same strange one seized the boy and brought him to the Sket like the wind, and placing him on a haystack, he became invisible. After being seen by the monks, the boy told them everything that had happened to him, what he had seen and heard. And from that time the boy became very humble, and as if he was stupefied. A priest out of terror left a Sket with his son. This is from the Northern Thebaid and the St. Herman of Alaska Press, of Alaska Brotherhood. In a similar demonic kidnapping in the 19th century Russia, a young man, after his mother cursed him, became a slave of a demon grandfather for 12 years and was capable of appearing invisibly amongst men in order to help the demons sow confusion in their midst. Such true stories of demonic activity were commonplace in earlier centuries. It is a sign of spiritual crisis of today that modern men, for all their proud enlightenment and wisdom, are becoming once more aware of such experiences, but no longer have Christian framework with which to explain them. Contemporary UFO researchers seeking for an explanation of phenomena which have become too noticeable to overlook any longer, have joined today's psychic researchers in an attempt to formulate a unified field theory that will encompass psychic as well as physical phenomena. But such researchers only continue the approach of enlightened modern man and trust their scientific observations to give answers in a spiritual realm that cannot be approached objectively at all, but only with faith. The physical world is morally neutral and may be known relatively well by an objective observer. But the invisible spiritual realm comprises being both good and evil, and the objective observer has no means of distinguishing one from the other unless he accepts the revelation which the invisible God has made of them to man. Thus, today, UFO researchers place the divine inspiration of the Bible on the same level as that satanically inspired automatic writing of Spiritism, and they do not distinguish between the actions of angels and those of demons. They know now, after a long period when materialistic prejudices reigned among scientists, that there is a non-physical realm that is real, and they see it in effects in the UFO phenomenon. But as long as they approach this realm scientifically, they will be just as deceived by unseen powers as the most naive contactee. When they try to determine who or what is behind UFO phenomena and what the purpose of the phenomena might be, they are therefore to indulge in the wildest speculations. Thus, Dr. Valdi confesses himself baffled whether the source of UFO manifestations might be morally neutral, unattended clockwork, benevolent, solemn gathering of wise men, as the extraterrestrial myth would have us believe, or a terrible superhuman monstrosity, the very contemplation of which would make man insane. That is, the activity of demons. A true evaluation of UFO experience may be made only on the basis of Christian revelation and experience, and is accessible only to the humble Christian believer who trusts these sources. To be sure, it is not given to man entirely to explain the invisible world of angels and demons, but enough Christian knowledge has been given to us to know how these beings act in our world and how we should respond to their actions, particularly in escaping the nets of the demons. UFO researchers have come to the conclusion that the phenomena they have studied are essentially identical with the phenomena that used to be called demonic, but only the Christian, the Orthodox Christian, who is enlightened by the patristic understanding of Scripture and the 2,000-year experience of saints' encounters with invisible beings, is able to know the full meaning of this conclusion. We're almost done here, guys. You're braver than any U.S. Marine. The meaning of UFOs. When then is the meaning of the UFO phenomena in our time? Why have they appeared just as this time of history? What is their message? To what future do they point? First, UFO phenomena are but one part of an astonishing outpouring of paranormal events which just in a few years ago most people would have considered as miracles. Dr. Vali in The Invisible College expresses a secular appreciation of this fact. Observations of unusual events suddenly loom into our environment by the thousands, causing a general shifting of a man's belief patterns, his entire relationship to the concept of the invisible. Something is happening to human consciousness. The same powerful force that has influenced the human race is in the past is in fact again influencing it now. In Christian language, that means a new demonic outpouring is being loosed upon mankind. In the Christian apocalyptic view, see the end of this book, we can see that the power which until now has restrained the final and most terrible manifestation of demonic activity on earth has been taken away. See 2 Thessalonians 2:7. Orthodox Christian government and public order, whose chief representative on earth was the Orthodox Emperor, and the Orthodox Christian worldview no longer exist as a whole, and Satan has been loosed out of his prison where he was kept by the grace of the Church of Christ in order to deceive the nations, Apocalypse 20:7-8, and prepare them to worship the Antichrist at the end of the age. Perhaps never since the beginning of the Christian era have demons appeared so openly and extensively as today. The visitors from outer space and theory is but one of the many pretexts they are using to gain acceptance for the idea that higher beings are now to take charge of the destiny of mankind. Many reports of Bigfoot and other monsters show similar occult characteristics as UFO sightings and often they occur in connections with such sightings. Second, UFOs are but the newest of the mediumistic techniques by which the devil gains initiates into the occult realm. They are a terrible sign that man has become susceptible to demonic influence as never before in the Christian era. In the 19th century, it was usually necessary to seek out dark seance rooms in order to enter into contact with demons, but now one need only to look into the sky, usually at night. It is true. Mankind has lost what remained of basic Christian understanding up to now, and now passively places itself at the disposal of whatever powers may descend from the sky. The new film, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, is kind of shocking revelation of how superstitious post-Christian man has become, ready in an instant and unquestioningly to believe, to follow hardly disguised demons wherever they might lead. Two other recently discovered paranormal phenomena reveal how boldly the demons are now making use of physical means, in particular modern technical devices, in order to enter into contact with men. One Latvian researcher, now followed by others, discovered a phenomenon of mysterious voices which appear unexplainably on tape recorders, even when the recording is done under clinical conditions in totally soundless atmosphere, with results very similar to those of seances. The presence of a medium or a psychic in the room seems to help the phenomenon. See Konstantin Rodive, Breakthrough, an amazing experiment in electronic communication with the dead. Tapliger Publishing Company, New York, 1971. Metallic-voiced space people for some time have supposedly been using telephone to communicate with both contactees and UFO researchers. The possibility of a hoax in such a phenomenon, of course, is high. But the recent years, the voice of the dead, convincing those who are contacted, have been heard in the telephone conversations of their loved ones. It can hardly be denied, as the report of this phenomenon notes, that demons of old are marching amongst us again, to a degree unheard of in the past. Say that again, right? Third, the message of the UFO is prepare for Antichrist. The savior of the apostate world is coming to rule it. Perhaps he himself will come in the air in order to complete his impersonation of Christ. See Matthew 24:30, Acts 1:11. Perhaps only the visitors from outer space will land publicly in order to offer cosmic worship to their master. Perhaps the fire from heaven, as in Apocalypse 13:13, will be only part of the great demonic spectacles of the last times. At any rate, the message for contemporary mankind is expect deliverance, not from the Christian revelation and faith in the non-seeing God, but from vehicles in the sky. It is as a sign of the last time that there shall be terrors and great signs from heaven. Luke 21:11. Even 100 years ago, Bishop Ignatius Brianchaninov, in his book On Miracles and Signs, Yaroslavl, 1970, reprinted by Holy Trinity Monastery, Jordanville, New York, in 1960, remarked on the striving to be encountered in contemporary Christian society to see miracles and even perform miracles. Such a striving reveals the self-deception found in a self-esteem and vainglory that dwells in the soul that possesses it. True wonder workers have decreased and grown extinct, but people thirst for miracles more than ever before. We are gradually coming near to a time when a vast arena is to be opened up in numerous and striking false miracles, to draw to perdition those unfortunate offspring of fleshly wisdom who will be seduced and deceived by these miracles. Of special interest to UFO investigators, the miracles of Antichrist will be chiefly manifested in the aerial realm, where Satan chiefly has his dominion. The signs will act most of all on the sense of sight, charming and deceiving it. St. John the theologian, beholding the revelation of the events that are precede the end of the world, says that the Antichrist will perform great signs and even make fire come down from heaven upon the earth in the sight of men. Apocalypse 13:13. This is a sign indicated by Scripture as highest of the sign of the Antichrist, and a place of the sign is the air. It will be a splendid and terrible spectacle. Saint Simeon, the new theologian, for this reason remarked that the struggler of prayer should quite rarely look into the sky out of fear of the evil spirits in the air, who cause many and various deceptions in the air. Philokalia, the three forms of heedfulness. Many will not understand that miracles of Antichrist have no good rational purpose, no definite meaning. They are foreign to truth, filled with lies. They are monstrous, malicious, meaningless play acting, which increases in order to astonish, to reduce to perplexity and oblivion, to deceive, to seduce, to attract by the fascination of a pompous, empty, stupid effect. All demonic manifestations have the characteristics that even the slightest heed paid to them is dangerous. From such heedfulness alone, allowed even without any sympathy for the manifestation, one may be sealed with the most harmful impression and subjected to serious temptation. Thousands of UFO contactees and even simple witnesses have experienced the dreadful truth of these words. Few have escaped once they became deeply involved. Even the secular investigators of UFO phenomena have seen fit to warn people against their dangers. John Keel, for example, writes, dabbling with UFOs can be seen as dangerous as dabbling with black magic. The phenomenon preys upon neurotic, the gullible, and the immature. Paranoid schizophrenia, demonomania, and even suicide can result, and has resulted in a number of cases. A mild curiosity about UFOs can turn into a destructive obsession. For this reason, I strongly recommend that parents forbid their children from becoming involved. School teachers and other adults should not encourage teenagers to take an interest in the subject. UFOs, Operation Trojan Horse. In a different place, Bishop Ignatius Brianchinov recorded with awe the foreboding the vision of a simple Russian blacksmith in a village near Petersburg at the dawn of our present age of unbelief and revolution, 1817. In the middle of the day, he suddenly saw a multitude of demons in human form sitting in the branches of the forest trees, strange garments and pointed caps, and singing to the accompaniment of unbelievably weird musical instruments and eerie and frightful songs. Our years will come. Our will be done. Say Saint Nihilus Sviatnaya pod spudom Sergeyev Posad 1911. We live near the end of this very fearful age of demonic triumph and rejoicing, when the eerie humanoids, another of the masks of the demons, have become visible to thousands of people. By their absurd encounters take possession of the souls of those men from whom God's grace has departed. The UFO phenomenon is a sign to Orthodox Christians to walk all the more cautiously and soberly on the path to salvation, knowing that we can be tempted and seduced not merely by false religions, but even by seemingly physical objects which just catch the eye. In earlier centuries, Christians were very cautious about strange and new phenomena, knowing of the devil's wiles. But after the modern age of enlightenment, most people have become merely curious about such things and even pursue them, relegating the devil to a half-imaginary realm. Awareness of the nature of UFOs then can help awakening Orthodox Christians to a conscious spiritual life and a conscious Orthodox worldview that does not easily follow after the fashionable ideas of the times. The conscious Orthodox Christian lives in a world that is clearly fallen, both the earth below and the stars above, all being equally far from the lost paradise for which he is striving. He is part of a suffering mankind, all descended from one Adam, the first man, and all alike in the need of redemption offered freely by the Son of God by his saving sacrifice on the cross. He knows that man is not to evolve into something higher, nor has he any reason to believe that there are highly evolved beings in other planets. But he knows well that there are indeed advanced intelligences in the universe besides himself. There are two kinds, and he strives to live as to dwell with those who serve God, the angels, and to avoid contact with those who have rejected God and strive in their envy and malice to draw man into their misfortune, the demons. He knows that man, out of self-love and weakness, is easily inclined to follow error, to believe in fairy tales that promise contact with a higher state of higher beings without struggle of Christian life. In fact, precisely as an escape from the struggle of Christian life. He distrusts his own ability to see through the deceptions of demons, and therefore clings the more firmly to the scriptural and patristic guidelines which the Church of Christ provides for his life. Such a one has the possibility to resist the religion of the future, the religion of the Antichrist, in whatever form it presents itself. The rest of mankind, saved by a miracle of God, is lost. And that concludes, was that chapter 6 of Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future. If you actually manage to sit through all of this stuff, you should definitely buy the book, even if you are illiterate, just to have it as a trophy, as having read, now at least. Yeah, we're actually halfway through the book right now, so at this point you might as well buy it. Follow me on Twitter. It's at ORC_BR. My main account has been banned because of a joke. Donate to my PayPal if you wish. And I'll see you at some point in the near future where we're going to continue reading this book. Good night, guys.